A stranger sat beside me on a flight to Chicago. She kept staring at my profile for 2 hours straight. Right before landing, she touched my arm and asked if my mother was Laura Bennett. When I said yes, she pulled out a crumpled photograph, leaned in close, and whispered that she had been looking for me for 20 years. My stomach dropped. Then she showed me the date on the back of the photo and my entire reality shattered. I am Sydney, 33 years old, and a forensic accountant, who just uncovered a family secret that should have stayed buried. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I walked straight off that airplane with my fingers clutching the old photograph and a single folded document the stranger had pressed into my hands. My mind was racing, trying to process the absolute impossibility of what I had just learned. But I had no time to sit and think in the airport terminal. I had an obligation to attend. I drove my rental car directly from the airport to the affluent Chicago suburbs, pulling up to the wrought iron gates of a newly built, multi-million-dollar mansion. It was the extravagant housewarming and pregnancy announcement party for my younger sister Melanie. I pushed through the massive oak front doors, stepping into a foyer dripping with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with at least 50 high society guests holding expensive champagne flutes. The air hummed with live string music and the self-important chatter of the local elite. I barely had a chance to close the heavy door behind me or take off my travel coat before my mother Laura spotted me from across the room. Laura marched across the imported marble floor, her designer heels clicking sharply against the stone, her face locked into a practiced, elegant scowl. She did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how my flight was or if I was tired. Instead, she took a thick stack of catering invoices and slapped them directly against my chest with a resounding thwack. "Swipe your card for the caterers. Sydney." Laura announced, her voice intentionally pitched loud enough to make the nearby guests stop talking and turn to watch us. "I already covered the deposit. You show up late to your sister's party and you come empty-handed. As a low-level accountant on a starvation salary, the absolute least you can do is pay your share for tonight." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the grand entryway. I could feel the eyes of 50 strangers burning into my skin, taking in my simple slacks and blazer compared to my mother's tailored evening gown. For my entire life, this was exactly how Laura operated. Public humiliation was her favorite weapon to keep me in line, to remind me that I was the failure of the family, while Melanie was the shining, flawless star. She thrived on making me feel small, knowing I would usually swallow my pride just to keep the peace. The papers fluttered to the marble floor between us, displaying a grand total of $18,000. I did not bend down to pick them up. I stood my ground, clutching my purse tightly against my side, feeling the heavy weight of the photograph resting inside it. "I am not paying for this," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level so it would not betray the storm raging inside me. "The caterers are your responsibility, Mom." Laura let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed in the quiet room. "You are unbelievable. Your sister is celebrating the biggest milestone of her life, and you cannot even pitch in. You are just going to stand there and be a leech while the rest of us provide for this family." I felt my jaw tighten. "A leech?" I asked, letting my voice rise just enough to carry across the room so the wealthy guests could hear every word. "Mom, I spent the last 3 years paying off $50,000 of Melanie's student loans because you claimed the family design business was struggling. I took on extra shifts and ate instant noodles to clear her debt so her credit would not be ruined. And the very week I made the final payment, you bought her a brand new Porsche for her graduation. Do not talk to me about pitching in. I will not fund a single cent of this fake luxury." Melanie, who had been holding court by a massive swan ice sculpture, heard the commotion and rushed over. She wore a custom silk maternity dress and a look of absolute horror, playing the victim with practiced perfection. "Sydney, how could you do this to me today?" Melanie cried out, placing a protective hand over her barely visible baby bump and letting tears well up in her eyes. "Why do you always have to ruin everything? You are always so jealous of me and my happiness." Before I could respond to my sister's theatrics, a large hand clamped down hard on my shoulder. It was Terrence, Melanie's husband. Terrence was a highly successful African-American real estate developer who loved to flaunt his wealth and intimidate anyone he deemed beneath his tax bracket. He towered over me wearing a bespoke suit, an expensive watch, and a glare of pure contempt. "Watch your tone when you speak to my wife in my house," Terrence sneered, stepping between Melanie and me physically, trying to force me to step back. "You are completely out of line, Sydney. Do not act ungrateful. Laura has let you live in her old condo in the city for 5 years now. You live there essentially for free, while you pretend to be some big-shot accountant. So you are going to pick up those invoices, walk over to the catering manager, and pay the $18,000 right now. Consider it back rent. If you refuse, I will personally have my property management team evict you from that condo tomorrow morning." The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Laura crossed her arms, a triumphant smirk spreading across her perfectly manicured face. She was entirely confident that Terrence had just backed me into a corner I could not escape. They expected me to crumble, to apologize, to pull out my credit card, and empty my savings just to keep a roof over my head. They thought I was completely dependent on them, a helpless pawn they could push around forever. But they had no idea who I really was. They had no idea what a forensic accountant actually did for a living, and they certainly had no idea about the devastating documents currently sitting inside my purse. I looked at Terrence. He was standing with his chest puffed out, waiting for the tears. He was waiting for the familiar breakdown they had conditioned me to have since childhood. Melanie had her phone out, probably ready to record my humiliation for her private group chats. Laura had her chin tilted up, soaking in her perceived victory. I did not cry. I did not apologize. Instead, I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that cut through the silence of the grand entryway. The sound echoed off the marble walls, causing several guests to shift uncomfortably in their designer shoes. Terrence frowned, his arrogant posture faltering for a fraction of a second. He clearly had not anticipated amusement. "Evict me tomorrow morning," I said, taking a slow step toward him. "Terrence, for a man who claims to be a top-tier real estate developer, your due diligence is absolutely pathetic. You cannot evict a landlord from her own property." Laura scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "Do not be ridiculous, Sydney. I hold the deed to that condo. I let you stay there out of the goodness of my heart." "You held the deed 5 years ago," I corrected, turning my gaze to my mother. "But 3 years ago, I caught you secretly trying to take out a second mortgage on that unit using fraudulent income statements. You were desperate for cash to fund Melanie's lavish European vacation, and you were willing to risk the roof over my head to do it. So I protected myself. I formed an LLC and bought the condo outright through a third-party broker. You gladly took the cash payout and signed the papers without ever checking who owned the purchasing company. I have been my own landlord for 3 years." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of guests. Laura's face drained of color, her perfect makeup suddenly looking like a poorly painted mask. Terrence stepped back, his eyes narrowing as his real estate brain tried to calculate the legal implications of what I had just revealed. "That is impossible," Terrence stammered, pointing a finger at me. "You do not have that kind of capital. You are just a number cruncher." "A forensic accountant," I corrected him coldly. "I track hidden assets, unravel corporate fraud, and find the money that arrogant men like you try to hide." Which brings me to my next point. Since you love playing the big-shot developer, let us talk about your latest project. The new commercial plaza you are building downtown is going to be beautiful. I saw the architectural renderings online last week. Terrence crossed his arms, trying to regain his dominant stance. "My plaza has nothing to do with you. Leave my business out of this." "It has everything to do with me," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "You bought the development rights, Terrence, but you only secured a ground lease for the land beneath it. You thought you were dealing with some faceless corporate entity. You signed a 50-year lease with Apex Holdings, LLC. Do you know who the sole managing member of Apex Holdings is?" The color vanished from Terrence's face. His jaw actually dropped as the realization slammed into him. "That is right," I said, taking another step forward, forcing him to retreat. "I own the dirt your multi-million-dollar plaza is sitting on." I reviewed the contract you signed. There is a specific clause regarding unauthorized environmental modifications. Your crews started drilling into the bedrock last Tuesday without submitting the required impact reports to the landowner. You breached the contract, Terrence. I can legally terminate your ground lease tomorrow morning, seize the structural assets built on my property, and bankrupt your entire firm before lunchtime. The silence in the room was absolute. 50 wealthy guests stood completely frozen, holding their champagne glasses mid-air, witnessing the utter destruction of Terrence's carefully curated empire. Melanie could not handle it. The spotlight was no longer on her pregnancy. The narrative of her perfect life was collapsing in front of her country club friends. She let out a piercing shriek, stomping her foot on the marble floor like a petulant toddler throwing a tantrum. "You are lying," Melanie screamed, her face twisting into a mask of pure rage. "You are just a jealous, bitter spinster. You have always hated me because I got the husband, I got the baby, and I got the life you could never have. You are doing this to ruin my pregnancy announcement because you are furious that Mom gave me the family design business instead of you. You are just a lonely accountant trying to extort us." I looked at my sister, feeling nothing but pity. "Melanie, the family design business has been operating at a loss for 4 years. I did not want it. It is a sinking ship, and Mom only handed it over to you so she could avoid the liability. But please keep screaming. Your guests are getting a wonderful show." Laura's eyes darted around the room, seeing the judgmental whispers spreading among her socialite friends. Her empire of lies was cracking, and she needed to seize control immediately. She pulled her phone from her designer clutch, her fingers trembling with fury. "I am calling the police," Laura declared loudly, ensuring the crowd heard her. "This is extortion. You come into my home, threaten my son-in-law, and try to steal our property. You are going to jail, Sydney." She dialed the emergency number, holding the phone to her ear, while she marched right up to me. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. She pulled me close, masking her movement as a mother reprimanding a child, but her eyes were cold and dead. Laura leaned in, her breath hot against my ear, and whispered a threat meant only for me. "You want to play games with the big dog, Sydney. You think you hold the cards because you bought a piece of dirt. You are nothing. Even the social security number you used to file those LLC papers is buried in a mountain of debt I created. I own you. I have always owned you. You do not exist without me." Laura pulled back, a wicked smile playing on her lips as she spoke to the dispatcher on the phone, requesting police presence for a hostile intruder. She thought her whispered threat had broken me. She thought she had played her trump card, relying on the ultimate familial betrayal to force my surrender. She had absolutely no idea that her threat was the exact confession I had been waiting to hear. Red and blue lights instantly slashed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the foyer, casting frantic, spinning shadows across the imported marble floor. The wail of police sirens cut through the tense silence of the room, followed immediately by heavy footsteps on the front porch. 2 uniformed officers stepped through the heavy oak doors, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Right behind them walked Mr. Thomas, the family's longtime attorney. He was a man who charged $1,000 an hour to make Laura's problems disappear. He clutched a bespoke leather briefcase, wearing a look of absolute untouchable authority. Laura's entire demeanor shifted in a fraction of a second. The venomous predator vanished, replaced instantly by a trembling, terrified victim. She pressed a hand to her chest and pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "Officers, thank goodness you are here!" Laura cried out, her voice breaking with manufactured fear. "Arrest this woman immediately. She is trespassing in my son-in-law's home, physically harassing my pregnant daughter and attempting to extort us with forged real estate documents." Mr. Thomas stepped forward smoothly, placing a reassuring hand on Laura's shoulder before addressing the police. "I represent the family officers. This woman is a disgruntled, estranged relative. She is making baseless criminal threats regarding property fraud and ground leases. We want her removed from the premises and charged with extortion." Terrence stood taller, crossing his arms, looking completely vindicated. He genuinely believed his wealth, his status, and his mother-in-law's legal connections were about to throw me into the back of a squad car. One of the officers stepped toward me, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to step outside with us right now. Place your hands where I can see them." I did not raise my hands. I did not back away. Instead, I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored blazer. The sudden movement made the officer tense, but I slowly pulled out a sleek black leather credential wallet and flipped it open, holding it up for both officers to read. "I am not a trespasser," I stated, my voice echoing off the marble walls with absolute, unwavering authority. "My name is Sydney. I am a certified public accountant, and I hold a CFFA credential in Certified Financial Forensics. I investigate high-level corporate fraud, asset concealment, and white-collar crime for a living. If you put handcuffs on me tonight without verifying the county property deeds, you will be making yourselves directly complicit in a multi-million-dollar federal cover-up." The lead officer stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at my official badge, then looked over his shoulder at Mr. Thomas. Police officers deal with domestic disputes every day, but they know better than to blindly step into a federal financial minefield without checking the facts. Seeing their hesitation, I completely bypassed the police. I walked straight up to Mr. Thomas. He tried to look down his nose at me, but I could see the tiny bead of sweat forming at his temple. He knew exactly what a forensic accountant was capable of digging up. I reached into my purse and pulled out the crumpled photograph the stranger had handed me on the flight to Chicago. I held it up right in front of the lawyer's face, ensuring the guest standing nearby could see it too. The image showed a young man with a bright smile standing next to a woman with striking familiar features. "Do you recognize her?" "Thomas," I asked sharply. "Because Mom swore to me my entire life that my biological father's sister died in a tragic car accident 30 years ago. It was the perfect story to keep me isolated. But funny thing about dead people. They rarely book window seats on commercial flights from Seattle." Laura's fake tears stopped instantly. Her posture went completely rigid. "The woman on my flight was Joanne," I announced to the room, making sure my voice carried over the quiet string music still playing in the background. "My aunt. She is very much alive, and she has been looking for me for 2 decades. I pulled the folded legal document from my purse and slammed it onto the entryway table next to a tray of untouched champagne flutes. "20 years ago, you filed a fabricated death certificate for my biological father down in Texas," I said, turning my piercing gaze back to Laura. "You told everyone he abandoned us and left us with a mountain of crushing debt. But that was a calculated lie. You legally altered my birth year by a single digit. You petitioned the state government for a brand new social security number for me, claiming there was a clerical administrative error on my original paperwork." Melanie gripped Terrence's arm, her eyes wide with confusion. Terrence was staring at the documents on the table, his real estate developer brain rapidly trying to process the magnitude of the fraud I was laying out. "You took my original identity, the one legally tied to my father, and you kept it active," I continued, stepping closer to my mother. "You used my real social security number to open 20 different lines of credit. You effectively crushed me in hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt while I was still in middle school. You needed me financially ruined. You needed me entirely dependent on your charity so I would never have the resources to hire a lawyer and look into my own past." I refused to let her look away. "Because you knew if I ever dug into the records I would find the truth. I would find the $15 million offshore trust fund my father left exclusively in my name." The entire foyer erupted into frantic, hushed whispers. The guests who had not yet fled were staring at Laura with open shock. Terrence looked physically sick. He looked at Laura, then at Melanie, then back to me. The realization was hitting him hard. The seed money Laura had used to prop up his early real estate ventures was not inherited wealth. It was stolen money. The police officers exchanged uneasy glances, completely out of their depth in a room full of forged identities and offshore trusts. Mr. Thomas gripped his briefcase so tightly his knuckles turned white. I waited for Laura to crumble. I expected her to deny it, to scream, to play the victim again. But Laura did not flinch. She did not break down. Instead, she adjusted the diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. A slow, chilling smirk spread across her face. She looked at the police officers, then back at me, her eyes filled with cold, calculating amusement. "You are completely delusional," Sydney, Laura said, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. Do you honestly think you can march into this house with an old photograph and a wild conspiracy theory and take me down? You are pathetic. The statute of limitations for state-level Social Security fraud ran out 10 years ago. You cannot prosecute a crime that old in this state. She stepped forward, getting right in my face, her smirk widening into a triumphant grin. And as for that little $15 million trust fund, Mr. Thomas handled the paperwork flawlessly. As your legal guardian, I had the funds legally reassigned and drained to capitalize Melanie's design firm. You are standing in a house paid for by the very money you think you can claim. You are just a nobody with a shiny badge, and you have absolutely nothing. The two patrol officers shifted uncomfortably on the imported marble floor. Laura had spoken with the absolute certainty of a woman who had never faced a consequence in her entire life. Mr. Thomas, smelling blood in the water, adjusted his expensive silk tie and gave the officers a patronizing nod. He smoothly told them it was clearly a domestic dispute, fueled by my mental instability, urging them to quickly escort me off the property to avoid further embarrassing the family. The lead officer took a step toward me, reaching for my arm, his demeanor shifting from hesitant to authoritative. He was choosing the path of least resistance, siding with the multi-million-dollar estate owners over the supposedly rogue accountant. I took a smooth step back, avoiding his grasp entirely. I looked directly into my mother's triumphant eyes. You are absolutely right, Mom, I conceded, my voice carrying a deceptive, icy calm that made Terrence narrow his eyes. State-level identity theft and fraud statutes expired when I turned 23. You played the local jurisdiction game perfectly. You and Thomas tied up the trust fund dispersal with enough legal red tape to make it look like a tragic business loss on paper. Laura smiled, a cold, terrifying expression of pure victory. But you made one massive miscalculation. I continued, my voice rising in volume, commanding the attention of every single guest still frozen in the foyer. You thought stealing $15 million was a local issue. You forgot that moving stolen assets across state lines and hiding them in corporate entities triggers federal jurisdiction. Federal wire fraud, money laundering, and aggravated tax evasion do not have convenient expiration dates when the crimes are active and ongoing. Right on cue, the heavy double doors of the mansion swung open. The crisp evening air blew into the foyer, rustling the crystals on the chandelier overhead. A woman stepped over the threshold. She wore a sharp, dark pantsuit, her silver hair pulled back into a severe twist. Her face held the same striking features as my biological father, the exact same features from the photograph I had just shoved in Mr. Thomas's face. Laura staggered backward, her jaw dropping open. The triumphant smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. "Hello, Laura," Joanne said, her voice cutting through the room like a steel blade. "It has been 20 years. You look exactly as treacherous as I remember." Mr. Thomas stepped forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in to protect his wealthy client. "Ma'am, you are trespassing. I demand you leave this property immediately, or these officers will arrest you." Joanne did not even blink. She reached into her suit jacket and pulled out a leather badge wallet, flipping it open to display a gleaming silver shield. The two local police officers immediately recognized the federal insignia and took a synchronized step backward, their hands dropping away from their duty belts. Joanne Bennett Sr., Special Agent, Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division. She announced, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I am not here for a family reunion. I am here because my niece happens to be one of the most brilliant forensic accountants in the state, and she brought me a digital paper trail that lit up my department's fraud algorithms like a Christmas tree." Terrence suddenly looked like he might be physically sick. His aggressive, dominating posture completely collapsed. He looked at me, realizing exactly what I had been doing for the past few years, while they all thought I was just a bitter spinster living in their shadow. "You did not really think I spent the last 6 months quietly doing basic tax returns, did you, Terrence?" I asked, turning my focus entirely onto my brother-in-law. "When I found out about the stolen $15 million, I needed to know where it went." Mr. Thomas washed the initial funds, But you needed a way to bring that money back into the United States without triggering an IRS audit. Real estate development is the oldest trick in the book for washing dirty money. Terrence opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was visibly hyperventilating. I audited your firm, Terrence, I stated, hitting him with the undeniable facts. I bypassed your encrypted servers using the ground lease credentials you so carelessly handed over to my LLC. Exactly 2 years ago, you and Laura laundered $8 million of my stolen trust fund. You funneled it through 3 separate shell companies registered in Delaware, disguised it as foreign investment capital, and pumped it directly into your new commercial plaza project. I tracked the fraudulent K-1 forms and the Schedule C discrepancies. You committed massive, undeniable federal tax evasion. The wealthy guests began backing toward the exit en masse. No one wanted to be in the same room as a federal agent declaring a multi-million-dollar money laundering operation. The local police officers had fully retreated to the doorway, making themselves as small as possible. This was a federal takedown, and they wanted no part of the fallout. Mr. Thomas began slowly packing his briefcase, calculating how fast he could flee the country before his bar license was revoked. Melanie stood paralyzed by the ice sculpture. She was clutching her stomach, her perfect spoiled world disintegrating before her eyes. She looked at our mother, expecting Laura to fix it, to scream at me, to make the bad things go away like she always did. But Laura was staring at Joanne, completely trapped. Melanie turned her desperate, tear-filled eyes to me. Sydney, you are lying. Terrence is a legitimate businessman. Mom gave me the family design business because I earned it. She bought me a Porsche to celebrate my hard work. You are just trying to destroy us out of spite. I looked at my sister, feeling a dark, profound sense of justice. Oh, Melanie, you really are the perfect golden child. You are so blinded by the shiny things that you never bother to look at the price tag. I walked right up to her, invading her space, forcing her to look me in the eye. Mom did not just buy you a Porsche, Melanie. Mom needed a fall guy. She needed someone with a clean record to hold the bag when the federal government finally caught up with her. I pulled a thick stack of printed financial ledgers from my purse and dropped them onto the floor at her feet. She put your name as the primary managing director on every single one of those offshore shell accounts. Your signature is on the wire transfers. Your social security number is attached to the $8 million of untaxed laundered money. Melanie stopped breathing. She looked down at the papers, then slowly looked up at our mother. Absolute terror finally overriding her lifelong entitlement. I leaned in close so Melanie could hear every single syllable. When the IRS drops the hammer tomorrow morning, Laura and Terrence might be able to afford fancy lawyers to stall the charges. But you are the legal director of a fraudulent offshore enterprise. If the IRS drops the hammer, you are the one facing federal prison. The words federal prison had barely left my mouth before the grand foyer devolved into absolute pandemonium. You can always count on the ultra-wealthy to possess an impeccable, ruthless survival instinct. The moment Joanne flashed her federal badge and I laid out the offshore money laundering scheme, the 50 high society guests stopped their hushed whispering and started running. The live string quartet abruptly ceased playing, dropping their bows as if their wooden instruments had suddenly caught fire. Women in couture gowns and men in bespoke tuxedos scrambled for the massive oak front doors, abandoning their expensive champagne flutes on any available surface. A prominent local judge practically shoved a caterer out of the way to reach the driveway faster. Nobody wanted their good name or their own questionable finances attached to an active federal tax evasion raid. Within 60 seconds, the opulent entryway was entirely deserted, save for my immediate family, the 2 baffled local police officers, the corrupt lawyer, Mr. Thomas, Joanne, and me. The silence left behind by the fleeing elite was deafening, broken only by the sound of ice dripping from the melting swan sculpture. The 2 local police officers exchanged a long, panicked look. They immediately holstered their handcuffs and began backing toward the door, muttering that this was out of their jurisdiction, and quickly exiting the mansion to avoid getting tangled in a federal mess. Melanie stood frozen in the center of the foyer, her hands clutching her custom silk maternity dress. The reality of her situation was visibly crashing down on her, crushing the perfectly curated life she loved to flaunt. Her affluent suburban existence, the country club memberships, the luxury cars, All of it was built on a mountain of federal crimes with her signature sitting squarely at the bottom of the ledger. She spun around to face her husband, her face twisted into a mask of sheer panic and betrayal. "Terrence, tell me she is lying!" Melanie shrieked, her voice cracking violently under the strain. "Tell me you did not use my name to open offshore accounts. Tell me we are not going to federal prison because of a real estate deal." Terrence did not look at her. He was staring blindly at the stack of financial ledgers I had dropped at Melanie's feet, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. The arrogant, dominating real estate mogul who had threatened to evict me just 10 minutes ago was entirely gone. He reached out and grabbed Melanie's arm, muttering frantic, fragmented promises that it was a misunderstanding, that he could hire a crisis team, that he could fix it. But before he could formulate a coherent lie to placate his hysterical wife, the sharp, demanding ring of his cell phone cut through the tense air. Terrence yanked the phone from his pocket. He stared at the caller ID, his dark skin paling to a sickly ashen gray. He answered it, holding the device tightly against his ear with a trembling hand. I watched his entire world shatter in real time. The person on the other end of the line spoke for less than 15 seconds. Terrence slowly lowered the phone, letting it slip from his fingers. It clattered loudly against the imported marble floor. "My corporate accounts," Terrence whispered, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming authority. "The bank just froze my operational funds. All of them. A federal mandate." He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Laura. The devastating realization of what she had done to him finally clicked into place. My mother had not generously invested in his business. She had infected it. "You set me up!" Terrence roared, his voice echoing violently off the crystal chandeliers as he lunged forward. "You needed a clean corporate entity to wash that stolen trust fund money, and you used my firm. You used me as a goddamn mule." Laura stood perfectly straight, smoothing the front of her evening gown with infuriating composure. "Do not raise your voice in my house, Terrence. You willingly took that capital to save your failing commercial plaza. You happily spent the money." Terrence stepped aggressively into her personal space, all pretenses of high society manners completely stripped away. "I am not taking the fall for your offshore fraud, Laura. I will call the FBI myself. I will hand them every single email, every hidden contract, and every wire transfer receipt. I will throw you and your spoiled, useless daughter under the bus right now if it means keeping my firm alive and staying out of a federal penitentiary." Melanie let out a devastated, breathless sob, realizing her own husband was ready to sacrifice her to save his own skin. She collapsed onto the bottom step of the grand staircase, crying hysterically into her hands, entirely abandoned by the people who claimed to love her. But Laura did not flinch at Terrence's violent outburst. My mother had spent her entire life manipulating the people around her, moving them like pawns on a chessboard, and she always kept an insurance policy. Laura reached into her designer clutch and pulled out her smartphone. She tapped the screen a few times, her manicured nails clicking sharply against the glass. A moment later, an audio file began playing at maximum volume. Terrence's own voice filled the foyer, clear, crisp, and undeniable. "I hear you, Laura." The recorded voice of Terrence played through the speakers. "We route the 8 million through the Cayman entity, bypass the domestic tax trigger, and sink it directly into the Plaza Foundation. No one will ever look twice at a family loan. I will handle the paperwork." Laura tapped the screen again, stopping the audio. The silence that followed was suffocating. Terrence stared at her, his mouth opening and closing in absolute paralyzing horror. His leverage was gone. His threat of immunity was instantly destroyed. Laura smiled, a cold, calculated, sociopathic expression that sent a familiar chill down my spine. She slipped the phone back into her clutch with a slow, deliberate grace. "If I go down, Terrence, we all go down," Laura stated, her tone practically cheerful. "Every single one of us." Then Laura turned her gaze away from her ruined son-in-law. She locked her dead, predatory eyes directly on me. She took a slow step in my direction, the heels of her shoes echoing like a ticking clock on the marble floor. "But Sydney," she whispered, her voice dropping to a terrifying, venomous calm. "You will go down with us." Laura did not wait for my reaction. She turned sharply on her heel, her evening gown sweeping across the marble floor, and marched toward the antique mahogany credenza that anchored the far wall of the foyer. She bypassed the decorative crystal vases and pulled open a hidden lower drawer, retrieving a thick leather-bound folio. She walked back and slammed it onto the table right next to my stack of forensic ledgers. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the massive, empty room. You really think I would orchestrate a multi-million-dollar international money laundering operation without an insurance policy? Sydney? Laura asked, her voice dripping with venomous pride. You spent all this time digging into Terrence's business, assuming I was just using his company as a shield. But I do not just use people. I chain them to the ship so they cannot jump overboard. She flipped open the heavy folio revealing pages of dense legal text. They were the original commercial loan agreements for Terrence's Plaza project, the exact banking documents that secured the $8 million in fraudulent offshore capital. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted pages. Right there at the bottom of the final sheet was a signature. My signature. I used your original social security number, Laura explained, a wicked gleam dancing in her eyes. The same one I supposedly ruined when you were a child. I kept it active. I maintained a flawless payment history on a few obscure accounts, and I built up an impeccable credit profile over the last decade. When Terrence needed a primary guarantor for these commercial loans to satisfy the domestic banking regulations, I provided one. You. Terrence stared at the paperwork, his eyes widening in horror. You forged her signature, he breathed out, the realization finally dawning on him. You told me the offshore trust company was the guarantor. You told me the assets were legally shielded. I did what was necessary to secure the funding you begged me for. Laura snapped at him, not breaking eye contact with me for a single second. And now my brilliant self-righteous daughter is officially the primary co-signer on an $8 million fraudulent real estate venture. She leaned forward, tapping a manicured fingernail directly against my forged name. If you hand those ledgers over to your aunt, the IRS will seize Terrence's assets. The development company will instantly default on the loans, and the bank will come directly after the primary guarantor. You will be legally liable for $8 million in restitution. But the threat of financial ruin was not her true target. Laura knew exactly what mattered to me. She knew how hard I had worked to build a life entirely independent of her toxic influence. And what happens to a certified public accountant when they are implicated in a massive federal wire fraud investigation? Laura asked, her voice a cruel taunt. What happens to that shiny, certified financial forensics credential you are so proud of? You lose your license, you lose your firm, you lose your entire career. If I go to prison, Sydney, I am taking your entire life down with me. The room went dead silent. Melanie slowly lifted her head from her hands, a twisted, desperate glimmer of hope appearing on her tear-stained face. She thought Laura had just won. She thought the threat of mutually assured destruction would force me to take my ledgers, walk out the front door, and let them get away with the stolen trust fund. Mr. Thomas stopped packing his briefcase, stepping back toward the table, ready to snatch up the evidence the moment I caved to my mother's blackmail. Joanne stepped forward, her rigid federal agent demeanor momentarily cracking as she looked down at the forged documents. Her jaw tightened. She reached out and pulled the folio toward her, examining the signature and the attached notary stamp. Mr. Thomas had certainly earned his exorbitant hourly rate, ensuring the fraudulent paperwork looked completely ironclad to any passing glance. Sydney, Joanne said, her voice heavy with professional regret. The IRS protocols for this kind of exposure are absolute. If this document is in the banking system legally tying you to the laundered funds, the agency has no choice but to act on it. Even if we strongly suspect forgery, even if you brought us the case yourself as a whistleblower, you immediately become a person of interest. I looked at my aunt, waiting for the rest of the bad news. Pending a full federal investigation. Joanne continued, her tone grave. The state board will immediately suspend your CPA license. Your forensic credentials will be frozen. An investigation of this magnitude involving offshore shell companies, forged documents, and millions in hidden assets could take years to unravel. You will not be able to practice accounting. Your firm will be dismantled. Your professional reputation will be completely destroyed before you ever get a chance to clear your name in court." Laura let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. She crossed her arms looking like a queen surveying her conquered territory. "So what is it going to be? Sydney?" Laura demanded, her eyes burning with arrogant certainty. "Are you going to blow the whistle and destroy your own life? Or are you going to pick up your little paperwork, walk out that door, and go back to your miserable, pathetic existence while we enjoy the wealth you were too weak to hold on to?" Terrence and Melanie watched me with bated breath, silently praying that my fear of losing my career would outweigh my desire for justice. I looked down at the loan documents. I looked at the signature, staring closely at the loops and curves of my own name spelled out in dark blue ink. I analyzed the pen pressure, the slant of the letters, the specific way the ink pooled at the end of the final character. I did not panic. I did not reach for my ledgers. I did not back down. Instead, a genuine, completely unbored laugh escaped my lips. The sound echoed brightly in the tense foyer, causing Laura's smug smile to falter instantly. I reached out and traced my index finger right over the forged signature. "Mom, you always thought you were the smartest person in the room," I said, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable certainty. "You spent 20 years meticulously planning every detail of this fraud, confident that no one would ever catch your mistakes. But you forgot one tiny, crucial detail when you forged this paperwork." I lifted my gaze, locking eyes with my mother as the color rapidly drained from her face. "I am left-handed." The absolute silence that followed my declaration was heavy enough to crack the marble beneath our feet. Laura stared at me, the color draining from her meticulously contoured face. Her eyes darted from my left hand down to the forged signature resting on the mahogany table. For 20 years, she had manipulated my identity, my credit, and my future, but she had fundamentally ignored the physical reality of who I was. She did not know me. She had never bothered to know me. And that arrogant oversight was about to send her to federal prison. I picked up the heavy leather folio and turned to face the two local police officers who were still lingering near the doorway, completely captivated by the unraveling of a local dynasty. I held the document up under the bright, unforgiving light of the crystal chandelier. "I am a certified financial forensic accountant," I stated, pitching my voice to carry the absolute authority of an expert witness commanding a courtroom. "I have testified in federal fraud cases exactly like this one. Let me give you a free lesson in biometric analysis." I pointed a manicured finger directly at the baseline of the signature. When a right-handed person signs a document, they drag the pen across the page from left to right. This biomechanical motion creates a specific microscopic trench in the paper fibers. The physical pressure naturally anchors on the downstrokes. You can see it right here, where the ink visibly thins out on the loops of the letter S and the letter Y, because the right hand is pulling the pen away from its center of gravity. I pulled a high-powered jeweler's loop from my blazer pocket, a tool I carried to every audit, and tossed it onto the table in front of Mr. Thomas. He stared at it as if it were a live grenade. "But a left-handed writer does not drag the pen." I continued, my gaze locking onto my mother's terrified face. "We push it." Pushing a ballpoint pen across thick legal stock forces the roller ball to dig into the fibers on the upstroke. It creates a distinct microscopic pooling of ink at the top of every single arch. It forces a slight leftward slant at the anchor points. I drop the document back onto the table. This signature has zero ink pooling on the upstrokes. The pressure mapping is textbook right-handed. Any entry-level handwriting analyst at the FBI laboratory will take exactly 30 seconds to definitively prove that this is a biometric forgery. And since you were the sole legal guardian of the trust and the managing director of the originating account's mom, they are going to demand a handwriting sample from you the moment Joanne makes a phone call. Laura stumbled backward, her designer heels catching awkwardly on the edge of the expensive Persian rug. She grabbed the edge of the entryway table to steady herself. Her mouth opened, but only a dry, raspy sound emerged. The invincible matriarch was suffocating under the weight of her own hubris. Joanne stepped forward, crossing her arms over her federal badge. Her eyes were gleaming with professional admiration. "Sydney is absolutely correct. Joanne confirmed, her voice ringing with procedural finality. A forged signature nullifies the guarantor liability, but the forgery itself is merely a state-level offense. I smiled, turning back to my mother. And that is exactly where your real nightmare begins, Laura. I picked up the loan agreement and flipped to the routing cover sheet attached to the back. You did not just forge my signature on a piece of paper and hand it to a local bank teller. You scanned this multi-million-dollar loan packet. You uploaded it to a secure banking portal and transmitted it digitally from your IP address here in Illinois to a commercial lender headquartered in Delaware. By electronically transmitting a forged financial document across state lines, you committed federal wire fraud under Title 18 of the United States Code. Terrence let out a low, guttural groan. He ran both hands over his bald head, pacing frantically near the staircase. He understood the law. He knew exactly what those statutes meant for his real estate empire. And it gets better, I said, leaning casually against the mahogany credenza. Because you used my stolen social security number to legitimize the wire transfer, you just triggered the statute for aggravated identity theft. Melanie looked up from the stairs, her face streaked with mascara. What does that mean? She cried out, her voice trembling with raw panic. What does that actually mean for us? It means mandatory minimums, Melanie, I answered sharply. Aggravated identity theft carries a mandatory consecutive 2-year prison sentence. It cannot be served concurrently with the wire fraud charges. It gets added to the end of the sentence. And look at this folio. I slapped my hand flat against the thick stack of legal documents. There are 15 separate addendums, escrow releases, and collateral agreements in this packet. You transmitted 15 separate forged signatures across state lines. That is 15 individual counts of wire fraud and 15 individual counts of aggravated identity theft. You did not secure an insurance policy, Mom. You successfully documented your own inescapable multi-decade federal prison sentence. Laura looked physically ill. The commanding venomous predator was completely gone. She was trembling, her eyes darting frantically around the foyer as if looking for a secret exit that did not exist. The realization was absolute. There was no local judge she could bribe, no country club favor she could call in, and no expensive lawyer who could make federal biometric evidence disappear. The distinct metallic click of brass latches echoed through the room. I turned my head. Mr. Thomas had quietly snapped his bespoke leather briefcase shut. His face was slick with a cold sweat, his impeccably styled hair suddenly looking slightly disheveled. As the attorney of record who facilitated the loan, he had personally notarized the forged documents and authorized the digital transmission to Delaware. He was not just an observer. He was a direct active accomplice to a multi-million-dollar federal conspiracy. With his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, Mr. Thomas took a slow, calculated step backward. He was attempting to quietly edge his way toward the heavy oak double doors, desperately hoping that Laura's spectacular high-volume meltdown would provide him enough cover to slip out into the night and catch the first private charter out of the country. I pushed myself off the credenza and walked smoothly across the marble floor. I stopped, planting myself squarely in his path, completely blocking his exit to the driveway. I tilted my head, offering him a sharp, predatory smile. "Leaving so soon, Thomas?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "We haven't even talked about the Cayman Islands yet." Mr. Thomas froze, his polished leather shoes squeaking to a halt against the marble floor. The smug, untouchable aura of the $1,000-an-hour defense attorney evaporated entirely. He clutched the handle of his briefcase with white-knuckled desperation, looking frantically toward the empty driveway, as if a getaway car might magically materialize. "You cannot detain me," Thomas stammered, his voice lacking its previous baritone authority. "This is a private residence, and I am invoking attorney-client privilege. If you impede my exit, I will have you charged with unlawful restraint." I did not move an inch. I crossed my arms, blocking the heavy oak doors, and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Attorney-client privilege does not apply when the attorney is an active participant in an ongoing criminal enterprise, Thomas. It is called the crime fraud exception. I am sure they taught you that during your first year of law school. You might want to brush up on it, considering you are going to need a very good defense lawyer of your own. Laura shrieked from across the foyer, her voice cracking with hysteria. Do not say a single word to her, Thomas. She is bluffing. She has nothing but a forged piece of paper and a wild imagination. Walk out that door right now. I turned my gaze to my mother, watching her desperately try to maintain her grip on a collapsing empire. I reached into my blazer and pulled out a slim encrypted hard drive, holding it up for both of them to see. I am not bluffing, Mom, I stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality. I know exactly where the original $15 million went. For 2 decades, I believed your story. I believed my biological father left us with nothing but debt and a fabricated death certificate. But you made a fatal error. You forgot that financial institutions keep permanent archival records of international wire transfers. I looked back at the sweating lawyer. When Joanne finally tracked me down after 20 years, she did not just bring me a photograph. As an IRS investigator, she brought me the original routing numbers from the trust payout my father established the week before you declared him legally dead. Joanne stepped up right beside me, crossing her arms, presenting a unified, impenetrable wall between the corrupt lawyer and his freedom. We tracked the money, Thomas, Joanne declared, her tone carrying the crushing weight of federal authority. We followed the digital breadcrumbs you thought you buried in the late 90s. I took over the explanation, leaning in closer to the terrified attorney. You used your own law firm's escrow account to receive the initial life insurance and trust dispersals. That was your placement phase. Then you moved into the layering phase. You routed those funds through 3 separate dummy corporations registered in Nevada, intentionally muddying the paper trail to make it look like a series of complex corporate acquisitions. Terrence let out a low, guttural groan. He ran both hands over his bald head, pacing frantically near the staircase. He understood the law. He knew exactly what those statutes meant for his real estate empire. He recognized the exact laundering technique because he knew Thomas had trapped him in the exact same web. But the integration phase is where you got sloppy. I continued, my voice sharp and relentless. You wired the consolidated $15 million directly into a private wealth management account in the Cayman Islands. You thought offshore secrecy laws would protect you forever. But forensic accountants do not need to breach the Cayman Bank. We just need to follow the origin wires from the United States. You registered that offshore account under the name Laura Vance, my mother's maiden name. Not Laura the grieving widow, but Laura Vance, the untouchable offshore entity. Laura let out a strangled gasp. She grabbed the edge of the antique credenza, her knuckles turning bone white as the blood rushed from her face. You structured the entire wash, Thomas, I said, driving the final nail into his coffin. You facilitated the theft of my inheritance, and you took a massive percentage as your management fee. That makes you the architect of a federal money laundering conspiracy. Joanne unclipped her leather badge wallet from her belt and held it inches from the lawyer's face. The silver IRS criminal investigation shield caught the light of the chandelier, a blinding symbol of the trouble he was in. Let me explain exactly what is about to happen to you, Mr. Thomas, Joanne said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. We are looking at a textbook violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO charges. You are a licensed officer of the court, which means the federal sentencing guidelines mandate an aggravated enhancement for abusing a position of trust. Thomas swallowed hard. A bead of sweat dripped from his temple, rolling down his jawline and soaking into his expensive silk collar. You are going to be disbarred, Joanne continued relentlessly. The federal government will seize your firm, your personal assets, your home, and every dollar in your retirement accounts under civil asset forfeiture. You are looking at a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. You will lose everything you have ever built. Joanne stepped back, giving him one singular, terrifying path to salvation. Unless, of course, you decide to cooperate right here, right now. You flip on Laura, you hand over the master ledgers, you testify to the exact structure of the Cayman accounts, and I will personally speak to the United States Attorney about recommending immunity for your cooperation. Thomas looked across the room at Laura. My mother's eyes were wide, filled with a silent, homicidal warning. She silently mouthed the word no, her face contorted in a mask of desperate fury. But Mr. Thomas was not a loyal soldier. He was a mercenary. He was a coward who had spent his entire career protecting his own wealth and status. He looked at the federal badge, then at the encrypted hard drive in my hand, and finally realized the game was entirely over. He could not outrun an IRS forensic audit. He let out a pathetic, broken sob. His hands shook violently as he rested his bespoke briefcase on the marble floor. He clicked the brass latches open, the sharp snap echoing like a gunshot. He reached inside his fingers, trembling as he bypassed legal briefs and pulled out a worn black leather-bound ledger. He stood up slowly and handed the ledger directly to me. He did not look at Laura. "I did not keep the money," Thomas stammered, his voice cracking, completely destroyed by the pressure. "I just moved it. I swear to you, Sydney, I just moved it." He pointed a shaking finger at my mother, his eyes wide with a terror that went far deeper than the threat of federal prison. "Laura did not just steal from you." Thomas gasped out the words, tumbling from his mouth in a frantic rush. "The $15 million did not stay in the Cayman accounts. She leveraged it. She used your trust fund to back a shadow loan for a cartel distribution network operating out of Chicago. Laura did not just steal from you. She stole from the cartel." The word cartel dropped into the grand foyer like a live grenade. The oppressive silence that followed was entirely different from the quiet of social embarrassment. This was the suffocating, paralyzing silence of mortal terror. Melanie let out a sharp, breathless squeak, backing away from Mr. Thomas, as if the lawyer had suddenly caught a contagious disease. Terrence stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the mahogany wall paneling. His chest heaved against his tailored shirt. The arrogant real estate developer was completely gone, replaced by a man realizing he was standing on a trapdoor with a rope around his neck. Laura finally lost her ironclad composure. Her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of feral panic. She lunged forward, her manicured hands hooked into claws, aiming directly for Mr. Thomas's throat. "You miserable, lying coward!" Laura shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the crystal chandeliers. "Shut your mouth! Shut your mouth right now!" Before her hands could make contact, Joanne intercepted her. My aunt moved with the trained, efficient speed of a veteran federal agent, stepping smoothly into Laura's path and shoving her back by the shoulders. Laura stumbled, her designer heels sliding on the marble floor, and collapsed onto the bottom step of the grand staircase. "Sit down and stay there," Joanne commanded, her voice dropping to a lethal, authoritative register. "If you move toward a federal witness again, I will have you in handcuffs before you can draw your next breath." I ignored my mother's hysterical sobbing. My eyes were entirely focused on the black leather ledger Mr. Thomas had handed me. I opened it, my forensic training instantly taking over. I did not need a team of analysts to understand what I was looking at. The numbers told a story of staggering, reckless greed. I flipped through the pages, scanning the columns of incoming wire transfers, shadow loans, and corporate payouts. The pieces of Laura's glamorous high society life rapidly clicked into place. "Your interior design firm," I stated, my voice cutting through the heavy air. "The exclusive Chicago clientele. The massive staging contracts for high-rise condominiums. It was all a front." I looked up, locking eyes with my mother as she sat shivering on the stairs. "You did not just steal $15 million from my father's trust and hide it on a beach," I said, translating the ledger's coded entries. "You used my inheritance as collateral. You deposited the trust funds into a Cayman account to prove liquidity to a shadow bank in Chicago. Then you used your design firm to wash street cash for a criminal syndicate." Mr. Thomas nodded, frantically wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. "She inflated the invoices," he confessed, his words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "She billed them for imported Italian marble that never existed. She invoiced millions for custom European furniture that was never shipped. The syndicate handed her duffel bags of dirty street cash. She deposited it into the firm's operational accounts as legitimate design revenue, kept a 20% laundering fee for herself, and wired the clean money back to the cartel's shell companies." I stared at the ledger, sickened by the sheer scale of the operation. My father had spent his entire life building a legitimate fortune to protect me, and my mother had used it to underwrite organized crime. "And the $8 million you wired to Terrence?" I asked, tracing a specific column of numbers. "Where exactly did that come from?" Mr. Thomas swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward my brother-in-law. The cartel was auditing their own books. Thomas admitted, his voice barely a whisper. They noticed discrepancies. Laura got greedy and started skimming off the top of the laundering fees to fund her lifestyle. When the syndicate demanded an immediate return of $8 million in clean capital, she panicked. She could not liquidate the Cayman Trust fast enough without triggering an IRS red flag. So she used Terrence. Terrence let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. His dark skin had turned a sickly ashen gray. She funneled the dirty cartel cash directly into your commercial plaza development, Thomas explained, looking at Terrence with hollow, terrified eyes. She used Sydney's forged signature to secure a clean domestic bank loan to cover the tracks. You did not take an investment from your mother-in-law, Terrence. You took $8 million belonging to a Chicago drug syndicate, and you buried it in the foundation of your real estate project. The reality of the situation hit Terrence like a freight train. White-collar prison was a terrifying prospect, but it was survivable. The people who owned that $8 million did not file lawsuits. They did not care about subpoenas or federal regulations. If the IRS seized his plaza, or if his corporate accounts remained frozen, he would default on an $8 million debt to a cartel. They would not take him to court. They would put him in the trunk of a car. Terrence's high society veneer vanished instantly, replaced by a raw, primal instinct to survive. He pushed himself off the wall and lunged toward his wife. Melanie was sitting on the floor, clutching her custom silk maternity dress, entirely paralyzed by shock. Terrence grabbed her upper arm with a bruising force, yanking her roughly to her feet. "Get your coat," Terrence ordered, his voice frantic and wild. "Do not pack anything. Do not grab your jewelry. We are getting in the Range Rover right now and we are driving straight to Montreal. We are leaving the country tonight." "Terrence, you are hurting me," Melanie cried out, stumbling against his chest. "What about the house? What about the baby? We cannot just leave everything." "There is no house," Melanie, Terrence roared, shaking her slightly. "Do you understand what your mother has done to us? The money in my business belongs to the cartel. When they find out the accounts are frozen, they will come here. They will kill me and they will kill you. We have to run." He ignored her hysterical sobbing, dragging her across the marble floor toward the heavy oak front doors. He reached out his hand, shaking violently as he grabbed the brass handle. He yanked the massive door open, desperate to escape into the cool night air. But the driveway was no longer empty. Terrence stopped dead in his tracks. The sprawling, manicured front lawn was illuminated by a blinding sea of flashing red and blue lights. More than a dozen black tactical SUVs had silently surrounded the property, blocking the gate, the driveway, and the street beyond. Heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical vests were already swarming the perimeter, securing every possible exit. The flashing police lights pierced through the foyer's stained glass windows, casting eerie, rotating shadows across Laura's terrified face. Terrence slowly backed away from the open door, his hands raised instinctively in the air, his escape route entirely cut off. Joanne stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. She looked out at the sea of federal agents, then turned her cold, uncompromising gaze back to my ruined family. "Nobody is leaving," Joanne stated, her voice echoing with absolute, devastating finality. "The house is already seized under civil asset forfeiture." The red and blue strobes of the police cruisers painted the grand foyer in harsh, flashing colors, cutting through the warm glow of Laura's expensive chandeliers. Heavy footsteps echoed up the front steps as a team of federal agents in tactical gear breached the entryway, their physical presence instantly shrinking the cavernous room. Terrence dropped his hands to his sides, the fight completely draining from his rigid frame. He was no longer the untouchable real estate mogul of Chicago. He was just another cartel associate, caught in a federal net, calculating the minutes he had left before his life ended, either in a prison cell or at the bottom of the Chicago River. Melanie stood frozen in the center of the marble floor. Her eyes darted frantically from the federal agents securing the heavy oak doors to the IRS badge gleaming on Joanne's belt, and finally to the black ledger resting in my hands. The pristine golden child illusion she had worn her entire life was violently shattering. The seized mansion, the frozen bank accounts, the impending RICO charges meant her luxury SUVs, her country club memberships, and her endless shopping sprees were vaporized. She was looking at absolute, inescapable ruin. A strangled sob tore from her throat. She ripped her arm out of Terrence's weak grasp and stumbled across the foyer toward me. Her designer maternity dress caught around her knees as she threw herself forward, literally dropping to the cold marble floor at my feet. "Sydney, please," Melanie wailed, her hands reaching out to grab the hem of my blazer. I stepped back smoothly, forcing her hands to grasp nothing but empty air. "You have to stop this," she begged, her voice cracking with raw hysteria. I did not know. I swear to God, Sydney, I had no idea about any of this. I did not know about the cartel, or the forged signatures, or the Cayman accounts. Mom just told us she had a wealthy investor for Terrence's development. I trusted her. You cannot let them take Terrence away. You cannot let them take my house. I am pregnant, Sydney. Look at me. I just want to be a good mother to my baby. You cannot send a pregnant woman to federal prison. I looked down at my older sister. For 32 years, she had been the undisputed princess of this family. She had been paraded around as the standard of perfection, while I was treated as the ungrateful burden. Now stripped of our mother's stolen wealth, she was just a terrified accomplice trying to use her unborn child as a human shield. I did not feel a shred of pity. I crouched down slightly so I was directly at her eye level. The foyer fell dead silent, save for the heavy breathing of Mr. Thomas and the sharp crackle of a federal agent's radio near the doorway. "Do not play the victim with me, Melanie," I stated, my voice dangerously calm and precise. "You are not a victim. You are a beneficiary of a criminal enterprise, and you knew exactly what you were doing." Melanie shook her head violently, tears ruining her flawless makeup, but I did not let her speak. "You did not know the exact routing numbers," I continued, locking my gaze onto her panicked eyes. "But you absolutely knew the money was stolen. 4 years ago, when you wanted that brand new Porsche Cayenne, your credit was maxed out. Mom handed you a set of keys and told you the lease was in my name. You knew my signature was on that dealership contract. You knew I was working 60 hours a week at a mid-level accounting firm, eating instant ramen in a studio apartment, while you drove a $100,000 car that I was supposedly financing." Melanie swallowed hard, her mouth opening and closing as she desperately searched for an excuse that did not exist. "You knew I was paying your loans while you wore Prada?" I said, my words hitting her like physical blows. "When you needed $200,000 for the down payment on your summer house, Mom magically produced a cashier's check drawn from an account bearing my social security number. You saw the paperwork, Melanie. You signed the escrow release. You knew I was being bled dry to fund your perfect suburban fantasy. You simply chose to look the other way because the money kept flowing." I stood back up, towering over her. "Ignorance is not innocence, Melanie. You happily spent cartel money that was washed through my stolen identity. You are an accessory after the fact to wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and federal money laundering. Being pregnant does not grant you a pass from federal sentencing guidelines. You are going to share a cell block with Mom." Melanie let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She looked back at Terrence, who was now being quietly handcuffed by 2 agents near the staircase. She looked at Mr. Thomas, who was leaning against the wall, weeping openly into his hands. Finally, she looked at Laura. Our mother was still sitting on the stairs, her face a rigid mask of cold fury. Laura did not offer Melanie a single word of comfort. She did not reach out to her pregnant daughter. Laura just glared at her with the calculating, detached eyes of a cornered predator, evaluating who to sacrifice next. In that split second, the golden child dynamic evaporated entirely. Melanie realized what I had known for 20 years. Laura loved no one but herself. If push came to shove, Laura would happily let Melanie take the fall to reduce her own sentence. Melanie's tears stopped. The panic in her eyes instantly sharpened into something incredibly ruthless and desperate. She pushed herself up from the marble floor, ignoring her mother's warning glare entirely. Melanie turned back to me and Joanne, her breathing ragged but her voice suddenly devoid of all its previous hysteria. She had learned a few things from the matriarch after all. I will give you everything. Melanie screamed, the sheer volume of her voice startling Mr. Thomas. Laura shot up from the staircase. Shut your mouth, Melanie! Laura roared, lunging forward before an armed agent pushed her back down by the shoulders. Do not say another word. Melanie ignored her, completely locking her desperate eyes onto Joanne's federal badge. She did not just use paper ledgers. Melanie confessed her words, rushing out at lightning speed. Thomas does not have the whole picture. Mom kept a secondary physical hard drive. It has the original digital encryption keys for every single offshore shell company in the Caymans. It has the direct communication logs with the Chicago syndicate. It proves exactly who authorized the transfers. Joanne stepped forward, her interest instantly piqued by the mention of undeniable encrypted cartel evidence. Where is it, Melanie? Melanie crossed her arms defensively over her chest, stepping backward away from her mother and aligning herself directly in front of the federal agents. She was playing her final desperate card to save herself from the wreckage. I know exactly where she hid it, Melanie declared, her voice trembling but resolute. I will walk you right to it. I will hand you the cartel's entire financial network on a silver platter. But you have to grant me full federal immunity right now. The word immunity had barely left Melanie's lips before Laura snapped. The meticulously crafted mask of the grieving widow and high society matriarch shattered completely, revealing the cornered, venomous animal underneath. With a guttural scream that sounded entirely inhuman, Laura lunged. Her manicured hands were hooked into claws aiming directly for Melanie's face. She crossed the marble distance in a fraction of a second, fully intending to tear her pregnant daughter apart to silence her. But Terrence moved faster. Driven by the paralyzing terror of a cartel death sentence, Terrence stepped directly into Laura's path. He threw his entire body weight against his mother-in-law, his hands slamming into her shoulders. The impact sent Laura flying backward. She crashed hard against the polished mahogany banister, the heavy thud echoing through the cavernous foyer. Before Laura could regain her footing, 2 federal agents swarmed her. They pinned her arms behind her back, pressing her face against the ornate wooden spindles of the staircase. She thrashed wildly, her designer dress riding up her thighs, her heels kicking at the shins of the tactical officers. "Get your hands off me!" Laura shrieked, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. She is lying. She is a hysterical, ungrateful brat trying to save her own skin. Joanne ignored the chaotic struggle entirely. She stepped right into Melanie's personal space, her federal badge gleaming under the chandelier light. "Show us," Joanne commanded, her voice dropping to a low, uncompromising register. "Take us to the drive right now, Melanie. If we find it, and if it contains exactly what you claim, I will personally guarantee your immunity agreement with the U.S. Attorney. But if you are stalling, I will let the cartel sort out your husband's debts." Melanie swallowed hard, her entire body trembling. She pushed herself up from the floor, her hands shaking as she smoothed down her maternity dress. She did not look at Terrence, and she explicitly avoided looking at her mother, who was still fighting the federal agents on the stairs. "Follow me," Melanie whispered. She turned and began the slow, heavy climb up the grand staircase. Joanne and I followed immediately, flanked by 2 armed IRS criminal investigators. The sounds of Laura's muffled screaming faded slightly as we reached the second-floor landing and walked down the plush, custom-carpeted hallway. Melanie stopped at the end of the corridor, pushing open a heavy, solid wood door. She reached inside and flicked a switch. Soft, warm light flooded the room. I stepped past her, taking in the space. It was the nursery. The room had been designed with an absurd, sickening level of opulence. A hand-carved Italian crib sat in the center of the room, draped in imported silk canopy netting. Hand-painted murals of whimsical forest animals covered the walls. A massive custom mahogany changing table occupied the far corner. Every single item in this room had been purchased with money laundered for a violent underground syndicate. Melanie wrapped her arms around her pregnant stomach, standing near the doorway, as if stepping further into the room would somehow contaminate her. Over there, Melanie said, pointing a shaking finger toward the baseboard near the changing table. The large brass return vent for the HVAC system. I came in here a few weeks ago to check paint samples. Mom did not hear me walk in. I saw her putting something behind the grate. One of the federal agents immediately dropped to one knee. He holstered his weapon and gripped the edges of the brass vent. He gave it a sharp tug. It did not unscrew. The entire metal grate popped off effortlessly, held in place only by heavy-duty industrial magnets. The agent reached a gloved hand into the dark, dusty cavity. He pushed aside a false piece of ductwork and illuminated the space with his tactical flashlight. "We have a safe," the agent called out, his voice echoing slightly in the hollow wall. "It is bolted directly to the foundation studs. Digital keypad." Joanne stepped forward, looking down at the flush, matte black steel door hidden in the shadows of the drywall. She turned her sharp gaze to Melanie. "What is the access code?" Joanne asked. Melanie shook her head frantically, fresh tears spilling over her eyelashes. "I do not know. I swear to you, I do not know. She never told me. I just saw her close it." Heavy, struggling footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Two agents practically dragged Laura into the doorway of the nursery. Her hair was completely disheveled, her expensive silk dress torn at the shoulder. When she saw the exposed wall safe, she stopped fighting the agents. Her chest heaved, but a dark, terrifying smirk spread across her face. "You are wasting your time!" Laura spat, her voice dripping with pure arrogance. "It is a commercial-grade vault. You can seize the house all you want, but you cannot compel me to give you the passcode. By the time you get a federal warrant to drill it open, my contacts in Chicago will have wiped the offshore accounts remotely. You have absolutely nothing." I set my leather tote bag down on the imported mahogany changing table. I walked across the plush nursery rug and knelt beside the federal agent, gesturing for him to step aside. I stared at the blank digital keypad, the green LED screen waiting for input. I did not need a blowtorch. I did not need a hacking device. As a forensic accountant, I knew that the greatest vulnerability in any security system was never the technology. It was the psychology of the user. "You aren't a criminal mastermind, Mom," I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the quiet nursery. "You are a textbook narcissist. You lack the imagination for a randomized, secure numeric sequence. People like you always protect your most valuable illicit assets with the things you view as your most prized personal possessions." I reached out and typed 6 digits into the keypad. The month, the day, and the year of Melanie's birth. A sharp electronic beep pierced the silence. A heavy mechanical clunk reverberated inside the wall as the steel locking bolts retracted. The heavy vault door sprang open. Laura's smug smile vanished instantly. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow shell of a woman. I reached into the dark safe and pulled out a heavy titanium-cased external solid-state drive. It was sleek, cold, and entirely out of place in a baby's room. I stood up, holding the drive. I walked over to the changing table, unzipped my tote bag, and pulled out my Ultrabook. I flipped the screen open, waiting for the operating system to boot. The room was dead silent as I connected the encrypted drive to the laptop port. The screen flashed black. A stark red command prompt box immediately populated the center of the monitor. A warning text scrolled across the screen in bright white lettering. AES 256-bit military-grade encryption detected. From the doorway, Laura's silence broke. It started as a low, breathless chuckle building rapidly into a harsh, grating sound. She threw her head back against the doorframe, laughing hysterically. "You think you are so smart, Sydney?" Laura mocked, her laughter echoing manically off the walls of the nursery. "You think a birthday was going to hand you the keys to the kingdom?" She leaned forward against the grip of the federal agents, her eyes wild and triumphant. "You will never guess the decryption key, and if you guess wrong 3 times, it wipes the data forever." The red warning text on my laptop monitor cast a harsh, bloody glow across the polished mahogany of the changing table. AES 256-bit encryption. A single incorrect keystroke too many, and the self-destruct protocol would engage rewriting the drive with garbage data until the cartel's offshore ledgers were permanently pulverized into digital dust. Laura's manic laughter echoed down the hallway, slicing through the heavy silence of the nursery. She was reveling in her perceived invincibility, feeding off the sudden palpable spike of anxiety radiating from Terrence and Melanie. "You think a basic safe code translates to military encryption?" Laura taunted, her voice dripping with venomous triumph as the federal agents held her firmly in the doorframe. "You are out of your depth, Sydney. You are an ungrateful, mediocre accountant trying to play a high-stakes game. Touch that keyboard again, and you will wipe the only leverage keeping your sister's husband out of a cartel body bag." Terrence let out a choked, panicked noise. He strained against the cuffs binding his wrists, his eyes wide with absolute terror. "Sydney, stop," Terrence begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Do not touch it. We need to call a tech team. We need an expert. If you wipe that drive, they will kill us." Joanne stepped forward, her federal badge catching the ambient light. She crossed her arms, her gaze fixed entirely on me. "No tech team can bypass AES 256 without the key before a three-strike wipe protocol executes." Joanne stated, her tone strictly clinical. She looked down at my laptop, then back to my face. "This is your play, Sydney." I did not flinch. I did not pull my hands away from the keyboard. I simply closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, tuning out Terrence's hyperventilating and Laura's smug, grating snickers. My forensic training took over, narrowing my focus to cold, hard data and behavioral psychology. I opened my eyes and turned to face my mother. "You are right about one thing, Mom," I said, my voice eerily calm, cutting through her arrogance like a scalpel. "This is not a basic safe code. You bought military-grade encryption because you knew exactly who you were dealing with. But you are still a textbook narcissist. You believe you are the smartest person in any room you walk into." Laura's smirk faltered for a millimeter, her eyes narrowing as she glared at me. "A true narcissist never trusts a randomly generated string of alphanumeric characters." I continued, stepping slowly toward the doorway, so I was standing just a few feet away from her. "You could have used a password manager. You could have let the software generate a 64-character unbreakable key, but you did not. You chose the password yourself. You needed it to mean something to you. You needed it to be a constant private validation of your own superiority." I turned back to the laptop, hovering my fingers over the keys. "Your greatest triumph," I stated, staring at the blinking red cursor. "The moment you felt entirely untouchable in your high society world. The Chicago Architectural Design Excellence Award. You spent $1 million of stolen money buying the votes for that trophy just to prove you belonged among the elite." I typed rapidly. The name of the award followed by the exact date of the gala. I hit the enter key. The screen froze for an agonizing second. Then a harsh, buzzing error tone sounded from the laptop speakers. The red box flashed violently. "Password incorrect. 2 attempts remaining." Melanie let out a piercing shriek, burying her face in her hands. Terrence dropped to his knees, openly weeping onto the nursery floor. Laura threw her head back and laughed again, a dark, terrifying sound that lacked any trace of maternal warmth. "Wrong," Laura mocked, her eyes flashing with predatory delight. "Go ahead, Sydney. Try again. Kill your sister's future. Be the disappointment I always knew you were." I ignored her, staring at the red warning text. The tension in the room was thick enough to suffocate on. 2 federal agents shifted uncomfortably behind Joanne. I analyzed the psychological misstep. The award was vanity, but it was not her true shield. What was her primary asset? What did she value above all else as her ultimate tool for manipulation? My gaze shifted to Melanie, who was rocking back and forth on the floor in her expensive maternity dress. The golden child. The perfect daughter. The entity Laura used to launder her reputation and secure her criminal loans. "Of course," I murmured, my fingers finding their position on the keyboard again. "You never truly loved Melanie, but you worshipped what she represented. She was your perfect, compliant proxy." I typed Melanie's full legal maiden name, entirely capitalized, followed immediately by her 9-digit social security number. It was the ultimate statement of ownership. I slammed the enter key. The hard drive whirred, the progress bar stalled. Another sharp, unforgiving error tone ripped through the silence. Password incorrect. 1 attempt remaining. Data wipe imminent on next failure. Joanne stepped directly up to the changing table, her jaw clenched tight. Sydney, she warned, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. If you do not know it, step away. We cannot risk the data. I did not move. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly still. I stared blankly at the screen, blocking out Melanie's hysterical sobbing. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my wallet. My fingers bypassed my credit cards and slid into the hidden back compartment. I pulled out a small, worn, faded photograph. It was a picture of my biological father taken just months before he died. His smile was warm, his eyes tired but kind. He was the man who had worked his entire life to build a legitimate fortune to protect me. I stared at his face, and Joanne's words from our flight to Chicago echoed clearly in my mind. Your mother never cared about the money as much as she cared about beating him, Joanne had told me over the hum of the jet engines. Her ultimate high was not spending the cash. It was the day she successfully finalized the theft. It was the absolute, undeniable proof that she had conquered the man who saw right through her. I looked up from the photograph. I turned my head slowly, locking eyes with Laura. The triumphant, mocking smirk was still plastered across her face, waiting for me to fail. She was waiting for me to lose everything, just like she had forced my father to lose everything. It was not about the golden child. It was not about the vanity awards. It was about pure, unadulterated conquest. You hated him, I said, my voice dropping to a razor-sharp whisper that carried across the room. You hated him because he knew exactly what you were. He built a $15 million trust to keep me safe from you. He locked it down with ironclad legal protections. Laura's smirk finally faltered. Her eyes widened a fraction of an inch, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossing her features. You spent 2 years battling in probate court after his funeral. I continued, my fingers resting lightly on the keys. But that was not the password. The password is the exact day the Cayman Bank officially cleared the wire transfer. The exact moment you shattered his legacy and took complete, absolute control of his wealth. I looked down at this keyboard. I typed my father's full legal name. I added the exact monetary figure down to the decimal point. I finished it with the specific date the $15 million vanished from domestic jurisdiction. I did not hesitate. I pressed the enter key. The nursery fell into a suffocating, dead silence. Terrence stopped breathing. Melanie froze. Joanne leaned over my shoulder, her eyes glued to the monitor. The red warning box vanished. A bright, vibrant green bar shot across the screen. The mechanical whirring of the hard drive stabilized into a smooth, steady hum. Access granted. Decrypting files. Thousands of folders instantly populated the screen. Shadow ledgers, Chicago cartel communication logs, Cayman Island routing numbers, forged signature manifests. The entire criminal enterprise completely laid bare in high definition. I turned away from the screen and looked at my mother. Laura's face was entirely drained of color. The arrogant, untouchable high society matriarch was gone, replaced by an ashen, hollow woman staring directly into the abyss of a life sentence. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated the dark nursery, casting long, sharp shadows against the hand-painted walls. Row after row of digital ledgers populated my monitor. For the last decade, my mother had treated me like a useless, math-obsessed disappointment. Now those exact forensic accounting skills were about to dismantle her entire existence. I ignored the cartel laundering folders for a moment, my eyes tracking the origin of the funds. I isolated the primary Cayman Island shell corporation Laura had established to drain my father's trust, but as I ran a rapid pivot table to consolidate the historical deposits, my brow furrowed. The numbers did not make sense. $15 million was the baseline principal she stole after the probate court battle. But there was a secondary continuous revenue stream. Massive quarterly wire transfers were still funneling into the primary account, totally independent of the dirty Chicago street cash she was washing for the syndicate. These deposits were entirely clean, originating from a legitimate domestic corporate holding firm. I rapidly traced the routing numbers back through the shell company's hierarchy. The source accounts belonged to three of the largest telecommunications conglomerates in Silicon Valley. "You did not just steal a lump sum," I stated, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. I looked at the line items, the pieces of my father's brilliant, quiet life snapping into focus. He was a systems engineer. He did not just manage networks. He patented a foundational piece of fiber optic routing architecture in the late 90s. Laura pressed her lips together, her eyes darting away. She was shivering, trapped in the grip of the federal agents. The trust was never just a static $15 million. I continued, my fingers flying across the trackpad as I opened the master royalty ledger. He retained the licensing rights. Every time a major tech firm utilized his infrastructure protocols, the trust accrued royalties. You have been quietly collecting seven-figure royalty checks for 20 years. I highlighted the entire column of accrued assets and hit the auto-sum function. The final number flashed onto the screen in stark, undeniable green text. $45.8 million, I read aloud. That is the true value of my father's trust. You have been sitting on nearly $50 million of clean, legally protected capital entirely out of the reach of the IRS. The number hit the room like a physical shockwave. Terrence slumped against the wall, the breath rushing out of his lungs in a ragged gasp. The arrogant, untouchable real estate developer who had spent years mocking my studio apartment and my instant ramen budget was staring at me with hollow, bloodshot eyes. He had just risked federal prison and a cartel death sentence to secure an $8 million dirty loan. His entire commercial plaza, his luxury cars, his country club memberships, everything he used to define his manhood was absolute pocket change compared to what I now legally controlled. He had thrown his life away for a fraction of my rightful inheritance. Melanie let out a whimpering, agonizing cry. She pushed herself up onto her knees, clutching her pregnant stomach as the sheer magnitude of our mother's betrayal washed over her. The golden child illusion finally burned to ash. "You gave me the dirty money," Melanie sobbed, staring at Laura with absolute revulsion. "You had $50 million in clean cash sitting offshore. But when I needed money for my house, when Terrence needed funding for his business, you made us sign the cartel paperwork. You made us wash the blood money." Laura sneered, her vanity overriding her survival instinct. "I was not going to touch the principal, Melanie. That money was my retirement. You and Terrence needed to earn your keep." Melanie dry-heaved, the sickening reality of her existence taking hold. She had played the perfect compliant pawn her entire life. She had eagerly accepted Laura's stolen scraps, parading around in designer clothes, and judging my modest life, believing she was the winner. In reality, she had traded a peaceful, legitimate future to become a criminal accessory for a mother who viewed her as entirely expendable. She was going to federal prison while the sister she treated like garbage was an actual multimillionaire. "You sold your soul for a leased Porsche and a fake suburban fantasy, Melanie," I said, my voice completely devoid of empathy. "You could have just lived an honest life." Joanne stepped up to the changing table, pulling a specialized federal flash drive from her tactical vest. "Mirror the entire drive," Sydney Joanne instructed, her eyes locked on the scrolling cartel ledgers. "We need a complete forensic copy before we transport it to the evidence lockup." I initiated the secure transfer protocol, watching the progress bar begin its slow march across the screen. While the system worked, I continued to click through the root directory, ensuring no encrypted subfolders were attempting to run hidden executable files. Near the very bottom of the directory, completely isolated from the financial ledgers and the cartel communication logs, sat a single, heavily encrypted folder. The title was just one word: contingency. I broke the encryption on the folder using the same master password. Inside were 3 high-resolution PDF documents. I clicked the first one open. The blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. It was a commercial life insurance policy. It was fully underwritten, with premium payments drawn directly from the clean royalty accounts, ensuring it would never flag a domestic audit. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat as I read the meticulously drafted legal text. You took out a life insurance policy on me, I whispered, the sheer horror of the discovery paralyzing my hands. The room fell deathly quiet. Joanne leaned in her eyes, scanning the document on the screen. Her hand instinctively dropped to the handle of her service weapon. It is a $5 million policy on my life, I stated, reading the terms aloud. I scrolled down to the execution page, my eyes locking onto the designated recipient. And the sole beneficiary in the event of my unexpected death is Melanie. I turned slowly, looking from the policy documents to my pregnant sister and finally to my mother. The word contingency echoed violently in my mind. Laura had laundered millions for a ruthless drug syndicate. If the cartel ever demanded their money back faster than she could liquidate it, she had built a $5 million safety net, a safety net that required me to die. The number hung in the sterile air of the nursery like a guillotine blade. I stared at the digital document on my laptop monitor, my eyes tracing the crisp legal font that essentially placed a bounty on my head. It was a commercial life insurance policy, fully funded, completely untraceable to domestic accounts, with Melanie named as the sole beneficiary. You were going to kill me, I stated. It was not a question. The sheer mathematical precision of the document sickened me. She had not just planned for an audit, she had planned for my execution. Melanie backed against the hand-painted wall of the nursery, her hands flying to her mouth in sheer horror. I did not know. Melanie whimpered, her entire body shaking violently as she stared at the screen. Sydney. I swear to God I did not know about this. I never signed anything. I would never want you dead. Joanne did not wait for my mother to offer an excuse. She signaled the armed agent standing in the doorway. The entire posture of the federal team shifted in an instant. White-collar financial fraud was a paper chase. Murder was a violent felony. The agents immediately unclipped their heavy steel handcuffs, stepping forward and locking Laura's arms securely behind her back. This significantly changes our operating parameters, Joanne announced, her voice slicing through the chaos with absolute authority. We are upgrading this raid immediately. This is no longer just a RICO case. We are now looking at conspiracy to commit murder across state lines for financial gain. The word murder echoed off the vaulted ceiling. That was the final breaking point for Terrence. Financial fraud and asset seizure meant a ruined reputation and a manageable stint in a minimum security facility. Accessory to a cartel-backed assassination meant a life sentence in a maximum security penitentiary. Terrence threw himself forward, dropping hard onto his knees on the plush carpet. I have information, Terrence screamed, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. His hands were clasped together, pleading with Joanne. I want a deal. I will tell you everything she planned. Just keep me out of federal prison. I will testify to all of it. Terrence did not wait for Joanne to offer terms. He just started talking, the words spilling out in a panicked, breathless rush. 2 months ago, Terrence gasped, pointing a shaking finger directly at Laura. I overheard her in the home office. She was on a burner phone with one of her syndicate contractors. She was furious because Sydney was asking too many questions about the trust payouts. She told them the secondary accounts needed to be secured permanently. Terrence swallowed hard, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. She paid them $200,000 in cash, Terrence confessed, his voice trembling. They were supposed to break into your condo while you were sleeping. They were going to tamper with the HVAC unit and block the exhaust flues. They were going to stage a massive carbon monoxide leak. It was supposed to look like a tragic, unavoidable maintenance failure. You would just go to sleep and never wake up, and Melanie would inherit the $5 million payout to cover the cartel debts. A deep, chilling realization washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. 2 months ago, I had noticed subtle discrepancies in my mail delivery. Small things around my building had felt slightly out of place. Trusting my instincts and my forensic training, I had quietly purchased a secure, unlisted townhome under a corporate shell name and moved out of my condo in the middle of the night. I had continued to leave lights on timers at the old place to maintain the illusion I still lived there. My paranoia had not been an overreaction. It had literally saved my life. Terrence's confession shattered the very last remnants of Laura's sanity. The sophisticated, untouchable high society matriarch completely vanished. Her elegant facade crumbled, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She fought against the federal agents holding her, kicking violently at the heavy mahogany changing table. "You miserable coward!" Laura shrieked at Terrence, her voice guttural and raw. She thrashed against the steel cuffs, cutting into her wrists. "You pathetic, weak little man!" Then she snapped her vicious gaze toward me. There was no mother left in her eyes. There was only a cornered predator robbed of its kill. "You were always the problem, Sydney." Laura spat, the venom in her voice echoing through the opulent nursery. "From the day you were born, you ruined everything." She leaned forward, her face purple with unhinged fury. "Your father looked at you like you were the only thing in the world that mattered," Laura screamed, unleashing decades of bitter, rotting resentment. "He built that massive fortune, he patented that brilliant technology, and he locked me out of it completely. He knew I wanted the lifestyle, and he deliberately structured that trust to ensure I could not touch a single cent of it. He left everything to his precious, boring mathematical daughter." The agents yanked her backward, but she kept screaming, her voice cracking under the strain of her absolute rage. "I spent 2 decades building an empire," Laura roared, glaring at me with psychotic intensity. "I gave this family power, status, and absolute perfection. But you were always lurking in the background. You were too quiet. You were too observant. You watched everything I did with those judging, calculating eyes of yours." Melanie covered her ears, sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, but Laura ignored her entirely. Her obsession was entirely fixed on me. "You were going to figure it out eventually." Laura screamed, her elegant silk dress ripping at the seams as she fought the federal agents. "I knew it was only a matter of time before you dug into the routing numbers and found the royalties. I had to protect my legacy. You were a threat to everything I built. You should have died in that condo." The echo of my mother's murderous declaration had barely faded before Joanne gave the order. She did not raise her voice. She simply issued a sharp, definitive nod to the tactical agent standing by the doorframe. "Take her down," Joanne instructed. The physical removal of Laura was immediate and completely devoid of the societal deference she had demanded her entire life. 2 federal agents seized her arms, twisting them forcefully behind her back. Laura thrashed like a rabid animal caught in a snare. She kicked wildly, her expensive designer heels gouging into the polished mahogany of the changing table. The sharp mechanical click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around her wrists cut through her manic, unhinged screaming. "You cannot do this to me!" Laura shrieked, the veins in her neck bulging against her skin. "I am a pillar of this community. I know the governor. I know federal judges. I will have your badges stripped by morning." The agents ignored her entirely. They hauled her backward, dragging her away from the nursery doorway. Laura fought every single step of the way. She dug her heels into the plush carpet, thrashing her shoulders with such violent force that the seam of her custom-tailored silk dress caught on the door latch. The expensive fabric tore loudly, ripping all the way down her shoulder and exposing her bare back. Her elegant, meticulously crafted facade was completely obliterated. She was no longer a high society matriarch. She was a raving, disheveled criminal being physically dragged down her own grand staircase. The sound of her cursing echoed through the cavernous foyer, growing muffled only when the heavy oak front doors were shoved open. Through the nursery window, I watched the agents muscle her across the driveway. They slammed her against the side of a black federal SUV, patted her down, and shoved her roughly into the back seat. Inside the nursery, Terrence let out a loud, shuddering exhale. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, attempting to push himself up from his knees. He looked at Joanne with a sickeningly eager, desperate smile. "I told you everything," Terrence stammered, his voice trembling with relief. "I gave you the murder plot. I gave you the cartel contractors. That secures my immunity deal, right? I am a cooperating federal witness." Joanne turned slowly, looking down at Terrence as if he were a cockroach that had just crawled out of the floorboards. "Immunity is for witnesses who have not actively participated in laundering millions of dollars of cartel blood money through commercial real estate ventures," Joanne stated coldly. "You are not a witness, Terrence. You are a co-conspirator." Terrence's pathetic smile vanished instantly. The blood drained from his face as a third agent stepped forward, pulling another set of steel cuffs from his tactical belt. No, Terence whimpered, scrambling backward until his spine hit the nursery wall. No, wait, I cooperated. Sydney, tell them. I helped you. I tried to stop her from hurting you. You only tried to stop her when you realized you were going to take the fall, I said, my voice completely devoid of empathy. You happily spent the dirty money while you thought you were getting away with it. The agent grabbed Terence by the collar of his expensive polo shirt, hauling him to his feet. Terence began to sob, openly heavy, ugly tears streaming down his face as his wrists were locked together. His knees buckled, and the agent literally had to drag the weeping real estate developer out of the room, marching him down the same hallway his mother-in-law had just been dragged through. That left only Melanie. My sister was still curled on the floor in the corner of the nursery, hyperventilating as she clutched her pregnant stomach. She looked up at Joanne, her eyes wide with absolute paralyzing terror. I did not do anything. Melanie choked out, her voice barely a whisper. I just signed the bank forms she told me to sign. I did not know about the cartel. I did not know about the murder plot. You cannot arrest me. I am pregnant. Joanne looked at Melanie with a mixture of professional clinicality and utter disdain. You are not under arrest today, Melanie, Joanne said, tapping a folder against her thigh. The U.S. attorney will determine your level of criminal liability regarding the wire fraud. However, this property, the vehicles in the garage, and all associated bank accounts are officially seized under the federal civil asset forfeiture statutes. They were purchased with illicit cartel funds. This house no longer belongs to you. Melanie stared at her, uncomprehending. What does that mean? Where am I supposed to go? It means you are trespassing on federal property, Joanne answered bluntly. One of the agents stepped forward and dropped a heavy-duty black plastic garbage bag onto the floor right in front of Melanie's knees. You have exactly 1 hour to pack, Joanne instructed. You may take one bag. You may pack essential non-luxury clothing and basic toiletries. No jewelry, no designer handbags, no electronics purchased with illicit funds. If an agent catches you trying to slip a Cartier watch or a diamond ring into that bag, you will be arrested for attempting to steal seized federal assets. Do you understand? Melanie looked at the cheap plastic garbage bag, the absolute reality of her shattered life finally taking hold. The golden child who had spent her entire existence mocking my modest lifestyle and flaunting her stolen wealth was being evicted from her multi-million-dollar mansion with nothing but a trash bag. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail and buried her face in the plush carpet, sobbing uncontrollably. I did not offer her a hand. I did not offer her a comforting word. I simply picked up my laptop, secured the encrypted flash drive in my pocket, and walked out of the nursery. I descended the grand staircase, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble steps. The foyer was swarming with federal investigators bagging evidence and tagging expensive artwork. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the massive front windows, casting sharp, chaotic shadows across the walls. As I reached the bottom step, the front doors were pulled open. 2 armed tactical agents marched a man into the foyer. He was sweating profusely, his expensive bespoke suit wrinkled, his silk tie loosened around his neck. It was Mr. Thomas, the elite corporate attorney who handled all the family trusts, the real estate acquisitions, and the shadow ledgers. He had clearly rushed to the estate to do damage control the second he heard about the raid, only to be intercepted at the front gate by the federal perimeter team. The agents shoved him roughly toward a holding area in the living room, but as he stumbled forward, his eyes locked onto mine. He saw the laptop in my hand. He saw the cold, unyielding expression on my face. He knew exactly what I had just decrypted upstairs. Sydney. Wait! Mr. Thomas gasped, his voice reeking of absolute primal panic. He lunged toward me, completely ignoring the agents, who immediately grabbed his shoulders to pull him back. Sydney, please listen to me. The lawyer begged, his eyes wide and frantic as he fought against the agents holding him. I know what you have on that drive. I know you have the Cayman routing numbers. If you hand those specific ledgers over to the feds, the cartel will execute me before I even make it to a holding cell. I stopped walking. I turned slowly, looking at the man who had happily facilitated the theft of my father's legacy for 20 years. I can give you everything, Mr. Thomas pleaded, sweat dripping down his forehead. I am the sole managing partner of the firm. I can legally sign over all the firm's liquid assets to you right now. I will transfer my personal offshore accounts to your name. Just delete the ledgers with my signature. Let me walk away." I stared at him, taking in his pathetic, desperate bargaining. I adjusted the grip on my laptop case, maintaining perfect, unwavering eye contact. I smiled coldly. My smile did not reach my eyes. It was a sharp, razor-thin expression of absolute finality. Mr. Thomas, the primary architect of my father's financial ruin, stared at me with the wide, terrified eyes of a man watching the ground drop out from beneath his feet. He strained forward against the grip of the federal tactical agents. His expensive Italian leather shoes squeaked as they slipped on the polished marble floor. He was waiting for me to negotiate. He was waiting for me to name a price. In his corrupted, insulated world, every single moral boundary had a distinct monetary value attached to it. He truly believed he could buy his way out of complicity. "You think you still have assets to bargain with?" I stated, my voice echoing clearly over the chaotic, heavy hum of the federal raid taking place around us. "You think you can simply write a check and walk away from 2 decades of facilitating grand theft, money laundering, and cartel conspiracy?" I balanced my laptop case on the edge of a nearby mahogany console table. I did not open the laptop. Instead, I pulled my heavily encrypted smartphone from my blazer pocket. I tapped the screen, opening my sent mail folder, and turned the device so the bright retina display was mere inches from his sweating, desperate face. "Read it," I commanded. Mr. Thomas squinted, his breathing shallow and rapid. He read the recipient list first. The State Bar Association Ethics Committee, the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division, the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Unit. Then he read the attachments. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. I did not just copy the drive upstairs for the federal agents standing in this house. I explained, my tone strictly analytical, dissecting his absolute ruin with surgical precision. While Laura was screaming at me, I initiated a secure targeted data burst through an encrypted proxy server. I extracted every single shadow ledger bearing your digital signature. I pulled the wire transfer receipts proving you knowingly routed cartel cash into Terrence's commercial real estate shell companies. I attached the forged trust documents you filed in probate court to legitimize Laura's initial theft of my father's patents. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket, watching the realization of his doom wash over him. "You do not have a firm anymore, Thomas," I said, delivering the final crushing blow. "You do not even have a license." The last sliver of hope vanished from his face. His knees visibly buckled. If the federal agents had not been gripping his arms so tightly, he would have collapsed entirely onto the marble floor. He let out a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze, his chin dropping to his chest. The elite corporate lawyer who had spent his entire career sneering at me across polished conference tables was completely shattered. "Take him out of here," Joanne ordered, stepping down the grand staircase and joining us in the foyer. 2 IRS criminal investigators stepped forward, pulling Thomas from the tactical agents. They hauled his hands behind his back. The heavy metallic clank of the handcuffs resonated with a deeply satisfying sense of closure. "You have the right to remain silent," one of the IRS agents recited, his voice a dull monotone as they marched the broken lawyer toward the front doors. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." I stood motionless in the center of the foyer, watching the heavy oak doors swing shut behind them. The flashing red and blue police lights continued to pulse violently through the frosted glass panels, casting an eerie, rhythmic glow across the imported chandelier hanging above my head. I took a deep, steadying breath. I was watching the enablers of my lifetime of misery get methodically dismantled by the very system they thought they could manipulate. For my entire life, Laura had not acted alone. She had required an entire ecosystem of greedy, compliant, morally bankrupt individuals to maintain her empire. Terrence had willingly washed the blood money to fund his fragile ego. Mr. Thomas had buried the theft under a mountain of corrupt legal paperwork to line his own pockets. They had all looked the other way. They had all participated in my marginalization. They had all fed off my father's stolen legacy. Now that entire ecosystem was burning to the ground. Around me, the house was being systematically stripped. Agents and windbreakers were cataloging assets with ruthless efficiency. They placed bright red seizure tags on the antique grandfather clock, the custom silk sofas, and the priceless modern art hanging on the walls. The illusion of high society perfection was being packed away into federal evidence boxes. I turned away from the front door, preparing to walk out to Joanne's vehicle and officially leave this nightmare behind me forever. But a soft, hesitant footstep on the marble floor made me stop. I turned back toward the base of the staircase. Melanie stood there. She looked entirely unrecognizable. The glowing, arrogant golden child was gone. Her flawless camera-ready makeup was completely washed away by tears, leaving her face pale and blotchy. She had changed out of her designer maternity dress, now wearing a pair of faded sweatpants and a plain, oversized gray sweatshirt. In her right hand, she gripped the handle of a cheap, worn canvas duffel bag. It was the only bag the agents had allowed her to pack. It contained nothing but absolute basic survival essentials. No diamond jewelry, no luxury cosmetics, no credit cards tied to frozen accounts. She looked around the cavernous, echoing foyer, watching the federal agents tag the furniture she had spent her life bragging about. Then she slowly raised her eyes to meet mine. There was no entitlement left in her gaze. There was no superiority. There was only the raw, terrifying reality of a woman who had just lost her husband, her mother, her home, and every single dime of her unearned wealth in the span of a single hour. She took a slow, heavy step toward me. She gripped the strap of the duffel bag so tightly, her knuckles were stark white. She swallowed hard, her chest heaving, as she forced herself to speak to the sister she had spent a lifetime treating like absolute garbage. Sydney. Melanie whispered, her voice trembling so badly it was barely audible over the sound of the agents working in the next room. I did not respond. I simply stood there, my posture perfectly straight, waiting for her to speak. Melanie wiped a fresh tear from her cheek, her eyes dropping to the floor before forcing herself to look at me again. She shifted her weight, wrapping her free arm protectively over her pregnant stomach. I have nowhere to go. Melanie choked out the reality of her destitution, finally breaking her voice. The bank accounts are frozen. Terrence is gone. I do not have a car. I do not have cash. She took one more step, stopping just a few feet away from me. The golden child was finally begging the scapegoat. Will you please? Melanie pleaded, tears spilling over her eyelashes and dropping onto the cold marble floor. Will you at least pay for a hotel for me and the baby? The echo of her plea hung in the cold, cavernous space of the foyer. Melanie stared at me, her tear-streaked face twisted into a mask of absolute pathetic desperation. She shifted the weight of her cheap canvas duffel bag, her knuckles white. She was playing her final card, the only currency she thought she had left in this world. Familial guilt and the unborn child she carried. Sydney, please, Melanie begged, taking another agonizing step forward, her voice cracking under the weight of her sudden poverty. I am terrified. I have exactly $20 in my purse. My credit cards are declining. The agents took my phone and my laptop. I am pregnant. You cannot just leave me on the street. We are sisters. We share the same blood. You are going to be an aunt. I looked at her. I did not feel a single shred of pity. I did not feel the familiar suffocating weight of obligation that Laura had drilled into my psyche since childhood. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical clarity. We do not share the same blood, Melanie. I stated, my voice echoing off the marble floor, sharp and unyielding. And even if we did, blood is not a binding contract. It is a biological coincidence. Melanie recoiled as if I had struck her. She reached out, trying to grab my wrist, but I stepped back smoothly, keeping a calculated distance between us. How can you be so heartless? Melanie sobbed, wrapping both arms protectively around her swollen stomach, weaponizing her pregnancy with the exact same manipulative precision our mother had always used. I did not ask for Terrence to launder money. I did not ask for this raid. I am an innocent victim in all of this. I am carrying your family. You are not a victim, I corrected her immediately, cutting off her hysterical narrative before it could gain momentum. You were an active, willing participant in my destruction. Melanie shook her head violently, fresh tears spilling over her cheeks. No, Sydney, I swear to God. I just signed the tax returns Terrence put in front of me. I like the lifestyle, yes, but I never wanted you hurt. I never wanted you in danger. I tightened my grip on the handle of my laptop case. The absolute audacity of her selective memory was staggering. She wanted amnesty because the consequences had finally arrived, completely ignoring the decades she spent reveling in my marginalization. You stood by while Mom plotted to kill me for insurance money, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal cadence that made Melanie freeze entirely. You knew she despised my existence. You knew she was draining my father's legitimate estate to fund your luxury cars, your designer wardrobe, and this absurd mansion. You wore the diamonds bought with my father's blood. I did not know about the murder. Melanie gasped, her chest heaving as panic consumed her. I swear to God, Sydney, I did not know she hired contractors. But you knew about the theft, I countered ruthlessly. You knew I was working 80-hour weeks living in a modest condo, while you flaunted millions of dollars that did not belong to you. You laughed at me. You called my life pathetic. You actively participated in a 2-decade campaign to make me feel worthless, and you enjoyed every single second of it. Melanie opened her mouth, but no words came out. The truth stripped away her defenses, leaving her completely exposed. She had no counter-argument. She had no leverage. She had nothing. I am not your safety net. Melanie, I told her, delivering the absolute final boundary. I am not the family scapegoat anymore. You wanted the high society life. You wanted the cartel money. Now you get to experience the consequences. She dropped to her knees, the canvas duffel bag hitting the marble floor with a dull thud. She clasped her hands together openly, weeping, abandoning whatever shredded dignity she had left in front of the federal agents moving through the house. Please, Sydney, she wailed, bowing her head so low it nearly touched my shoes. Just one night, just a cheap motel. I do not know how to survive out there. I do not know what to do. I looked down at her. You can go to a women's shelter, I stated flatly. It builds character. I hear that's what low-level accountants do. The reference to her favorite condescending insult struck her like a physical blow. Melanie let out a shattered, agonizing gasp, burying her face in her hands. The realization that I was utterly impervious to her tears finally broke her. I did not wait for another excuse. I turned my back on my sister, walking toward the heavy front doors without a single ounce of hesitation. I did not look over my shoulder. I did not offer a comforting platitude. I simply walked away, leaving the golden child weeping on the floor of her seized, crumbling empire. The cool, crisp night air hit my face the second I stepped out onto the front portico. The sprawling estate was chaotic, swarming with federal agents, marked vehicles, and forensic accounting teams. The physical manifestation of Laura's greed was being methodically dismantled piece by piece. I walked down the grand driveway, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The heavy burden of a lifetime of familial abuse was gone, replaced by a profound, razor-sharp sense of freedom. I had survived them. I had outsmarted them. I had won. A sleek black federal SUV was idling near the wrought iron front gates. The passenger side door opened as I approached. Joanne was sitting in the driver's seat, the ambient light from the dashboard illuminating her sharp professional features. I slid into the passenger seat, closing the heavy door behind me and shutting out the noise of the raid. The interior of the vehicle was quiet and warm. It is done, I told Joanne, placing my laptop case on the floorboards. Thomas is in custody. The offshore ledgers are in the hands of the FBI. I know, Joanne replied, putting the SUV in drive. The local field office just confirmed receipt. The arrests are moving forward exactly as planned. She steered the vehicle away from the estate, the flashing red and blue lights fading into the rearview mirror. The dark, tree-lined suburban road offered a quiet contrast to the absolute destruction we had just left behind. I leaned back against the leather headrest, closing my eyes for a brief moment. I was ready to return to my secure townhome, ready to begin the next chapter of my life, completely untethered from the toxic weight of my mother and sister. But the night was not over. Joanne kept her eyes on the road, navigating the winding streets with practiced ease. With one hand, she reached into the center console of the SUV. Before we take you back to your secure location, there is one more piece of business we need to conclude, Joanne said, her tone shifting from strictly professional to something slightly more complex. I opened my eyes, sitting up straight. What business? We recovered the assets. The cartel link is severed. This is not about the federal investigation, Joanne clarified. She picked up a thick, cream-colored envelope from the console and handed it across the armrest to me. The paper felt heavy, expensive, and completely devoid of any official government seals or markings. There was no return address. The only thing written on the front was my name, inked in a sharp, elegant handwriting I did not recognize. I looked at the envelope, then looked at Joanne. What is this? Joanne glanced at me briefly before turning her attention back to the dark road ahead. It is a sealed letter, Joanne stated quietly, from your biological father. The heavy, cream-colored envelope rested in my lap like an unexploded bomb. Joanne navigated the black federal SUV away from the affluent, manicured streets of the suburbs, leaving the flashing police lights and my mother's shattered empire far behind us in the dark. We drove in absolute silence for 20 minutes, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the wet asphalt grounding me after the chaotic adrenaline of the raid. Joanne eventually pulled the vehicle into the neon-lit parking lot of a 24-hour diner on the industrial outskirts of the city. The rain had started to fall, streaking down the windshield and blurring the harsh streetlights. Let us get some coffee, Joanne stated, putting the SUV in park and unbuckling her seatbelt. We walked into the warm, nearly empty diner. The sharp scent of burnt coffee and fried food was a jarring, welcome contrast to the sterile, perfumed air of the mansion I had just left. We slid into a faded red vinyl booth in the far back corner, isolated from the few other patrons hunched over the counter. I looked across the sticky table at Joanne, the ruthless federal agent who had just orchestrated the total destruction of my family. I looked at the envelope in my hand, then back at her sharp, intelligent features. A sudden, piercing realization clicked into place. You knew him, I said. It was not a question. Joanne nodded slowly. She reached into her jacket, bypassing her federal badge, and pulled out a worn, faded photograph. She slid it across the table. It was a picture of my father laughing with his arms slung over the shoulders of a younger, smiling Joanne. He was my older brother, Sydney. Joanne revealed, her voice dropping its professional, authoritative edge for the very first time. I am your Aunt Joanne. When Laura realized she could not control him entirely, she made sure his side of the family was completely isolated. She cut us out of your life. I joined the bureau specifically to build the financial profile needed to take her down. He reached out to me right before he died. He gave me that envelope and made me swear to give it to you only when Laura was finally in handcuffs. My hands trembled as I looked down at the heavy parchment. I broke the wax seal, carefully unfolding the single sheet of thick paper. The handwriting was sharp, precise, and immediately familiar. I had not seen my father's penmanship since I was 10 years old. My dearest Sydney, if you are reading this, it means the fail-safes I put into place have finally been triggered, and Joanne has kept her promise to me. I need you to know the truth. I knew Laura was dangerous. I knew her greed was a bottomless pit that would eventually consume this family, and I knew she would try to take everything the moment I was gone. I could not stop her from seizing the primary estate or the domestic accounts. She had the local judges and the corporate lawyers in her pocket. But my patents and the core offshore accounts were a different story. I intentionally structured the Cayman trusts with a fatal tripwire. I set the offshore ledgers to require your specific biometric and legal verification to authorize any disbursements. I knew Laura would not wait for you to come of age. I knew her impatience and her absolute arrogance would force her to bypass the security. I knew she would forge those verifications. She thought she was outsmarting the system, but in reality she was walking blindly into a trap. She created an irrefutable, undeniable paper trail of federal wire fraud and identity theft. I structured it this way because I knew you were the only one smart enough to untangle the math. I watched you grow, my sweet girl. I saw your brilliant, calculating mind. You were never boring. You were observant. You were precise. You are my brilliant truth seeker. I am so incredibly proud of the woman I know you have become. Never let anyone convince you that your intellect is a flaw. It is your greatest weapon. I love you, Sydney. I always have. Dad. A visceral, agonizing sob ripped from my throat. The sound shattered the stoic, calculating facade I had maintained for 2 decades. It was a cry born from a lifetime of being told I was worthless, ordinary, and inadequate. I wept for the father who had loved me from afar, who had built a brilliant, inescapable fortress around my future, while simultaneously sacrificing his own peace. I pressed my face into my hands, the tears flowing uncontrollably. I finally received the emotional catharsis I had been starved of my entire life. I was not the scapegoat. I was not the boring disappointment. I was the architect of his justice. Joanne reached across the table, her hand warmly covering mine. She did not offer empty platitudes. She did not tell me to stop crying. She simply sat there guarding the booth, allowing me to fully grieve the childhood that had been stolen from me and the father who had protected me from the grave. It took a long time for the tears to finally stop. When they did, I carefully folded the letter and slid it into the breast pocket of my blazer, pressing it close to my heart. I felt completely hollowed out, yet lighter than I had ever felt in my entire existence. Joanne gave my hand one final squeeze before pulling her hand back. Her posture shifted, returning to the pragmatic, razor-sharp federal agent. The financial forensics team just finalized the asset tracking while you were reading, Joanne announced, her voice brisk and authoritative. The IRS process is officially complete. The shell companies Terrence and Laura used to hide the stolen funds have been entirely liquidated. I sat up straight, wiping my face with a paper napkin. What is the final count? Joanne pulled a printed federal manifest from her jacket pocket and slid it across the table. $45 million, Sydney Joanne stated, tapping a manicured finger against the bolded total at the bottom of the page. Every single cent of the original patent royalties, plus 20 years of compound interest. It has been legally routed back to its rightful owner. The funds are sitting securely in an unlisted federal account under your name. I stared at the staggering number printed on the document. It was not just money. It was 20 years of stolen autonomy. It was my father's legacy, fully restored and completely out of Laura's reach. The money is secure. Joanne continued, picking up the diner check and sliding out of the vinyl booth. But we are not entirely finished. You have one final legal meeting to attend tomorrow morning. 6 months passed with ruthless mechanical efficiency. The final legal meeting Joanne had mentioned that rainy night in the diner was simply the formal transfer of my father's recovered estate into my name. The true conclusion, the absolute end of the nightmare, arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning in a federal courtroom in downtown Chicago. The courtroom was a cavern of polished mahogany and cold, imposing authority. I sat in the front row of the gallery directly behind the prosecution table, flanked by Joanne and a team of federal litigators. The heavy side doors swung open, and the low murmur of the gallery died instantly. 2 armed United States Marshals escorted Laura and Terrence into the room. The physical transformation of my mother was staggering. The untouchable, perfectly manicured high society matriarch was completely gone, entirely erased by 6 months in a county holding facility. Laura wore a shapeless, bright orange federal jumpsuit that hung loosely on her thinning frame. Her expensive salon treatments had washed out long ago, revealing a harsh, jagged line of stark gray roots splitting her dull, unkempt hair. Deep dark hollows framed her eyes, and the arrogant, superior lift of her chin had been replaced by a bitter, haggard scowl. She looked frail, she looked aged, she looked entirely powerless. Terrence shuffled slightly behind her. He did not look up. His shoulders were slumped, his posture radiating absolute defeat. The tailored suits and aggressive corporate swagger had been stripped away, leaving only a terrified, broken man facing the crushing reality of federal prison. I glanced across the center aisle. Melanie sat 2 rows back. She was no longer draped in stolen diamonds or exclusive maternity couture. She wore a faded, pilling gray sweater and generic denim jeans. Her face was bare, her hair pulled back into a messy knot. She looked entirely unremarkable, just another struggling woman sitting in a courtroom gallery. She kept her eyes glued to her lap, her hands trembling as she clutched a cheap synthetic purse. She refused to look in my direction. The judge, an imposing man with a reputation for absolute zero tolerance regarding white-collar crime, called the court to order. After confirming the plea agreements and the extensive list of federal convictions, he looked over his reading glasses and asked the prosecution if the victim wished to address the court. I stood up. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as I walked down the aisle and stepped up to the wooden podium facing the bench. I arranged my notes, though I did not need them. I looked directly at the defense table. Laura glared back at me, her jaw clenched tight, a tiny spark of her old rotting venom still burning in her eyes. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I felt no fear, no intimidation, and absolutely no sorrow. I felt only cold, clinical clarity. Your Honor. I began, my voice carrying clearly through the pristine acoustics of the courtroom. For 20 years, the defendant, Laura, operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise funded entirely by stolen intellectual property and financial fraud. The metrics of her crimes are thoroughly documented in the federal indictment. $45 million embezzled. 2 decades of forged legal signatures. Hundreds of wire transfers routed through offshore accounts and cartel-backed shell companies. I paused, letting the sheer magnitude of the numbers hang in the heavy air. But the financial theft is merely a mathematical calculation. I continued, my tone remaining surgical and brutally precise. The true crime committed by this defendant was the systematic theft of a childhood and identity and fundamental human trust. She weaponized my very existence. She legally erased my biological father, stole his legacy, and then dedicated her entire life to painting me as a defective, unwanted burden. She funded her golden child and her lavish lifestyle with my stolen birthright, demanding my gratitude while actively engineering my marginalization. Laura gripped the edge of the defense table, her knuckles turning white, but her public defender placed a firm hand on her wrist, forcing her to remain seated. When the accounting discrepancies finally threatened to expose her empire, she did not hesitate, I stated, staring directly into Laura's hollow eyes. She priced my life at $200,000. She hired cartel contractors to stage a fatal accident in my home. She decided that my murder was an acceptable operational expense to protect her stolen wealth. I did not cry. My voice did not break. I delivered the undeniable truth with the cold clarity of a woman who had finally reclaimed her power. I asked the court to impose the maximum sentence, I concluded, stepping back from the microphone. Not simply for the financial ruin she caused, but for the absolute absence of humanity she has demonstrated for 20 years. I walked back to my seat, my spine perfectly straight. Joanne gave me a single approving nod as I sat down. The judge looked down from the bench, his expression grave. He reviewed the thick stack of documents in front of him, the heavy silence stretching across the room, wrapping tightly around the defendants. The crimes committed by these individuals represent a breathtaking level of greed, manipulation, and sociopathic calculation. The judge announced, his voice echoing with absolute authority. The subversion of the legal system, the laundering of illicit funds, and the conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain will not be met with leniency in this courtroom. He turned his gaze directly to the defense table. Terrence, the judge declared, for your role in the money laundering conspiracy and corporate wire fraud, I sentence you to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Terrence let out a choked, muffled sob, burying his face in his trembling hands. His lawyer patted his back, but Terrence just continued to weep into his palms. Laura, the judge continued, his tone turning to pure steel. For racketeering, grand theft, and conspiracy to commit murder across state lines, I sentence you to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. A sharp gasp echoed from across the aisle. Melanie covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her pale face. Furthermore, the judge finalized, striking his gavel against the sounding block with a sharp, definitive crack. I order the complete and total liquidation of every remaining asset, property, and holding tied to both defendants to satisfy the federal restitution order. You are remanded to the custody of the United States Marshals. The marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing Laura by the arms and hauling her to her feet. She did not fight this time. Her legs seemed to give out, and they practically had to drag her toward the holding cell doors. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind her, sealing her fate and entirely erasing her from my world. The heavy brass doors of the federal courthouse swung shut behind me, sealing the past away forever. The crisp Chicago wind whipped across the concrete plaza, but for the first time in my entire life, I did not feel cold. I stood at the top of the stone steps looking out over the bustling, vibrant city. Beside me, Joanne adjusted the collar of her trench coat, watching my face with a quiet, knowing pride. In my right hand, I held a single stamped manila envelope. It did not contain offshore ledgers, encrypted hard drives, or evidence of federal wire fraud. It contained a court-ordered decree of absolute identity restoration. The Social Security number. Laura had maliciously bound me to the digital cage she had used to ruin my credit, bury me in debt, and siphon away my legitimate inheritance was officially and permanently nullified. The federal judge had signed the order that morning, completely expunging the fraudulent financial history attached to my name. I had legally reclaimed my birth identity, securing the pristine financial record that my father had meticulously intended for me. The invisible chains Laura had wrapped around my throat were completely severed. I looked at Joanne and handed her the envelope. She smiled, a rare, genuine expression of warmth that mirrored my father's eyes perfectly. We walked down the courthouse steps together, no longer just a federal asset and her handling agent, but as family. Blood meant absolutely nothing without loyalty, but shared truth and mutual respect meant everything. Joanne had become my mentor, my closest confidant, and the only true family I actively claimed. I did not take my father's $45 million and vanish to a private island to live a quiet life of luxury. I took that massive capital and weaponized my intellect, honoring the exact mandate he had left for me in his letter. Within 3 months of Laura's sentencing, I launched my own forensic accounting firm right in the heart of the financial district. I leased the top floor of a high-rise, designing a sleek, impenetrable fortress of glass and steel where the truth could not be hidden. I specialized in one highly specific, deeply personal sector, dismantling familial financial abuse and unmasking corporate identity theft. I took the exact ruthless analytical skills I had honed while hunting down Laura's shadow ledgers and turned them into a top-tier enterprise. My reputation grew with terrifying speed. When wealthy, arrogant relatives tried to bury their theft behind forged family trusts, offshore shell companies, and fraudulent probate filings, my team tore their illusions apart piece by piece. I became the absolute worst nightmare for every toxic, entitled abuser who thought they could steal from their own blood without consequence. I was my father's brilliant truth seeker, delivering the exact same brand of ruin to corrupt enablers that I had delivered to Mr. Thomas and Terrence. A week after my firm officially opened its doors, I had one final piece of personal business to attend to. I drove my new custom-ordered Aston Martin down the familiar winding suburban roads of my childhood. I did not drive fast. I enjoyed the smooth, powerful hum of the engine and the quiet luxury of the pristine leather interior. I pulled up to the grand wrought iron gates of Laura's former estate. The gates were chained open, their electronic motors dead. The sprawling, manicured lawns were completely overgrown, choked with aggressive weeds and severe neglect. The bright red federal seizure tags had been replaced by stark bank foreclosure and public auction signs. I parked my car at the base of the grand circular driveway, stopping directly in front of the sweeping marble staircase where my mother had once stood and looked down on me with absolute disdain. A commercial real estate broker was waiting nervously near the portico, clutching a thick leather binder to his chest. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly intimidated by my arrival. I did not haggle. I did not negotiate a single term. I signed the final purchase agreements right there on the hood of my car. I bought the sprawling multi-million-dollar estate in a direct cash transaction for absolute pennies on the dollar. The bank had been desperate to offload the highly publicized tainted property, and I was the only buyer who showed up to the auction. The broker handed me the heavy property deed, offered a hurried, stammering congratulations, and practically sprinted to his vehicle to escape the eerie silence of the dead estate. I stood alone in the center of the driveway, looking up at the cavernous, empty mansion. It was a monument to unhinged greed. It was the physical manifestation of a stolen childhood, a house built entirely on the bones of my father's hard work. It was the hollow, rotting shell of Laura's fake high society empire, and it belonged to me now. I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer, pulled out my phone, and made a single brief call. A moment later, the low, mechanical rumble of heavy diesel engines echoed down the quiet suburban street. 4 massive yellow demolition excavators rolled through the open wrought iron gates, their heavy steel treads grinding harshly against the expensive imported driveway pavement. The demolition foreman stepped out of the lead vehicle, holding a bright yellow hard hat. He looked at me, then looked up at the sprawling mansion. He gave me a questioning nod, waiting for the final authorization. I nodded firmly, my expression set in stone. I did not look away as the first excavator raised its heavy steel claw high into the air and smashed directly through the grand oak front doors. The impact shattered the imported frosted glass panels and tore the massive crystal chandelier right from the ceiling. The deafening crash of breaking marble, shattering glass, and splintering wood filled the air, completely drowning out the silence of my past. I watched the walls of my childhood prison collapse into a violent pile of worthless rubble and thick gray dust. I watched the last physical trace of Laura and Melanie's unearned entitlement get reduced to debris. When the roof finally caved in, I turned my back on the wreckage. I opened the door of my car, slid into the driver's seat, and pressed the ignition. The engine roared to life. I drove away down the winding road without casting a single glance in the rearview mirror, completely independent, wildly wealthy, and finally absolutely free. The most powerful lesson from Sydney's journey is that biological ties do not excuse toxic behavior. For years, Sydney endured emotional abuse and financial exploitation under the guise of family loyalty. However, her ultimate victory wasn't just reclaiming her stolen inheritance. It was finding the courage to sever the invisible chains of manipulation. She taught us that true security comes from self-reliance, and setting ruthless boundaries is often the only path to genuine peace. You don't owe your future to those who tried to destroy your past. Have you ever had to establish firm boundaries with toxic family members? Share your experiences and comment below.